The storm came without warning, the way the worst things always do. 10 Harleys rolled through the blizzard like iron wolves, their headlights cutting white curtains of snow on Highway 36. Inside the Crow's Nest Diner, a grease and neon survivor clinging to the edge of nowhere, the Iron Ravens. Motorcycle Brotherhood wrapped their scarred hands around coffee mugs and spoke in the low, careful voices of men who'd learned long ago that silence kept you alive. Then the door opened. A little girl walked in, 9 years old, jacket too thin, sneakers soaked through, and looked straight at the most dangerous man in the room. My father had that same tattoo. Everything stopped, because the man she was describing had been dead for 3 months, and nobody outside this brotherhood was supposed to know his name. If this story of brotherhood, sacrifice, and a promise kept from beyond the grave hits you the way it's hitting me, just setting it up, drop a like right now and tell me what city you're watching from in the comments below. We're just getting started, and trust me, you do not want to miss where this goes. The Crow's Nest Diner had no business still existing. It sat at the dead end of a county road that the state hadn't repaved in 11 years, surrounded by pine forests that didn't care about anything, and a stretch of Northern California winter that had been trying to kill the place since before the current owner was born. The sign out front, Crow's Nest, hot food, cold beer, had lost its apostrophe sometime in the late 90s and nobody had bothered to fix it. The windows fogged from the inside. The booths were duct-taped vinyl, cracked along the seams like old skin. The coffee was terrible in the specific way that roadside diner coffee was always terrible, which meant it was also exactly right. The Iron Ravens owned 4 tables in the back. Not literally. There was no deed, no written agreement. But the Ravens had been stopping here every third Thursday of the month for going on 12 years, and Darlene, who'd worked the counter since the Clinton administration, always had the back section cleared and the coffee on by the time their headlights came sweeping through the parking lot. Some arrangements don't need paper, they just need time. Tonight there were 10 of them. Maddox Crow. Mercer sat at the head booth with his back to the wall, the way he always sat, everywhere, always, because old habits from old places didn't retire just because you did. He was 53 years old, built like a man who'd been through things and survived them by being harder than the things themselves. His hair had gone iron gray at the temples. The raven tattoo on his left forearm was 28 years old and still crisp, the lines clean, the bird's wings spread across the muscle in full flight. He'd gotten it at 19 in a shop that didn't exist anymore, from an artist who'd died of a heart attack 6 years back. Sometimes he thought about that. The permanence of a mark outlasting the hand that made it. Across from him sat Danny Wrench Kowalski, the club's road captain and resident mechanical genius, who was in the middle of explaining something about carburetor tolerances to anyone who'd listen. Nobody was really listening. That was also an old arrangement. Wrench talked about engines the way other men talked about women, with reverence and frustration, and the private knowledge that he understood them better than anyone else in the room. To Crow's left was Marcus Patch Delgado, who'd done 2 tours in Fallujah and come back with a purple heart, an arresting expression that made civilians nervous in grocery store lines. He wasn't mean. He wasn't even unfriendly exactly. He just looked at the world through eyes that had already seen its worst offer and filed it away. Sitting next to Patch, in contrast, was Jimmy Rios, 26 years old, the club's youngest full patch, who'd grown up 3 blocks from Crow's childhood neighborhood and joined the Ravens 2 years ago after his father's construction business folded and took his family down with it. Jimmy still had the kind of face where you could see what he was feeling. The older members considered this simultaneously his greatest liability and the thing that made him worth keeping. The other 6 spread across 2 tables: Hector, Bear, Dooley, Stitch, Lobo, and Cal. Men of varying size and silence and history, each one carrying a weight that didn't show unless you knew what to look for. Stitch had medical training from his time as a Navy corpsman and now ran a motorcycle repair shop that was legitimate 4 days a week. Bear, 6'4", 300 pounds, named for reasons that were entirely obvious, had the gentlest voice in the room and kept a photograph of his grandmother in his wallet. Hector had lost a son 8 years ago. He didn't talk about it. He also never missed a Thursday. Outside, the storm was getting worse. It had started as a typical Northern California winter warning, the kind of system that the weather apps flagged as a moderate advisory and local ranchers eyed with practiced suspicion. By the time the Ravens had rolled their bikes into the Crow's Nest lot and covered the Harleys with tarps borrowed from Darlene's storage room, it had become something meaner and more personal. The wind off the mountain was doing that particular thing it did in deep winter, where it didn't just push against you but seemed to find the specific gaps in your clothing and press through them. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees in the last hour. Snow was piling against the diner's front windows in slow, patient drifts. Crow watched it through the glass and turned his coffee mug slowly in both hands. His knuckles were scarred in the particular pattern of a man who'd been in fights with his fists, not picked them. A distinction that mattered to him, though he couldn't have fully explained why. The mug was warm. The coffee was bad. The sound of his brother's voices behind him was the specific kind of noise that felt like silence because it was comfortable. He hadn't been sleeping well. That was the thing he hadn't told anyone, because saying it out loud would require explaining it, and explaining it would require talking about Ghost. And talking about Ghost right now felt like pressing on a bruise that hadn't finished forming. 3 months. Ethan Ghost Cole had been dead for 3 months, killed by a black ice patch on a county road 400 miles south of where Crow currently sat, his bike going down at 60 miles an hour. In the kind of accident that wasn't anyone's fault and wasn't preventable, and wasn't anything except the universe being indifferent in the most specific and devastating way possible. They'd gotten word from a highway patrol officer who'd found Ghost's Ravens cut in the saddlebag and tracked the club's contact number through a database. The officer had been respectful, professional. He'd used the right words in the right order. It hadn't helped. Ghost hadn't been active with the chapter for 6 years. He'd patched out clean, no drama, no falling out. No debt left unpaid. He'd met a woman named Sarah when he was 41, a quiet and serious person who worked as a respiratory therapist and had a laugh that, according to Ghost's own description in the one phone call Crow still remembered clearly, sounded like something he hadn't expected to find in the world. He'd married her. He'd had a daughter. He'd chosen, deliberately and without apparent regret, to leave the road and build something different. The Brotherhood had let him go the way you let go of someone who's made a real choice. With respect, without pretending it didn't hurt, and with the understanding that the door stayed open even when the road didn't. Ghost had sent Christmas cards. Twice a year, without fail, a postcard arrived at the clubhouse with a photograph on the front, some diner, some stretch of highway, some unremarkable piece of American landscape that he'd apparently decided was worth documenting. On the back, always the same, a few sentences. Nothing dramatic. Just the ordinary proof that he was alive and all right and still aware of the people he'd come from. The last postcard had arrived 14 months ago. Then nothing. Then a highway patrol officer with the right words in the right order. Crow turned his mug again and looked at the snow pressing against the glass. The door opened. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. There was no cinematic pause, no moment of suspended sound. The door opened, a gust of frozen air cut through the diner's warmth, and a child stepped inside. She was small, young, maybe 8 or 9, hard to tell, because she had the kind of face that children develop when they've been asked to carry things they shouldn't have to carry yet. Her jacket was pale blue and entirely inadequate for the weather outside. Her sneakers were canvas, white ones, now the grayish beige of things that had been walked in hard and washed too many times. Her hair was dark and damp from the snow, pulled back in a ponytail that had mostly come loose. She stood just inside the doorway for a moment, scanning the room, not with the hesitation of a lost child looking for help, with the careful, methodical attention of someone who had learned to assess a space before committing to it. Darlene was already moving from behind the counter. "Honey, you all right? Are you alone out there?" The girl didn't answer Darlene. Her eyes had found Crow. She walked toward him. The back tables went quiet first. That particular silence that spreads from a center outward, like ripples from a stone. Wrench stopped mid-sentence. Jimmy looked up from his phone. Patch's eyes tracked the girl the way they tracked everything, calmly, completely, with no visible emotion. She stopped at the edge of Crow's table. Her eyes went to his left forearm, the raven tattoo. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at his face. "My father had that same tattoo," she said. The words landed like something dropped from height. Crow didn't move. He didn't react visibly, because 53 years and the life he'd lived had given him a face that could absorb almost anything without showing it. But his chest did something it hadn't done in a while, a cold dropping sensation, like a floor giving out beneath him. He looked at her eyes. Dark. Serious. the exact shade of brown that Ethan Cole's had been. "What's your name?" he said. His voice came out level. He was proud of that, distantly. "Lena," she said. "Lena Cole." The silence in the diner was now total. Even the cook had stopped whatever he was doing in the kitchen. The sound of the storm outside seemed suddenly louder, wind pushing against glass, snow accumulating, the world outside continuing its indifferent work. "Your father's name," Crow said. Not a question, but he needed to hear it. "Ethan Cole," she said. "But you called him Ghost." Behind Crow, someone, he thought it was Bear, exhaled a long, slow breath. Hector, at the far table, had gone very still in the way he went still when something was hitting him in the place where his son used to be. Crow looked at this little girl standing in front of him in her inadequate jacket and her soaked canvas sneakers, and her face that was too old for her age, and he felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean name for. It wasn't grief exactly, though it was close to grief's neighborhood. It was more like the recognition of a shape, the way you sometimes saw, in a stranger's face, the echo of someone you loved and lost, and the echo made the loss suddenly present again, immediate. The distance collapsed. "Sit down, Lena," he said. She sat. Darlene appeared at the table's edge with hot chocolate without being asked, set it down gently, and withdrew. Whatever was happening here, it was not a thing for Darlene to insert herself into. Some things you recognized as private even when they were happening in public. Crow waited while Lena wrapped both hands around the mug. Her hands were red from the cold. She wasn't shaking, but she'd been close to it. He could see the effort it had taken her to not shake, the small, controlled stillness of a child who'd learned that showing weakness in front of strangers had costs. "How did you get here?" he asked. "Bus to Reading," she said. "Then a truck driver gave me a ride to the county line. Then I walked." Crow calculated the distance from the county line to the Crow's Nest Diner. About 3 miles. In a blizzard. In canvas sneakers. "How long were you walking?" "About an hour and a half, I think." He nodded slowly. "How'd you know we'd be here tonight?" She reached into her jacket, the inner pocket, the one close to the chest, and pulled out an envelope. It was folded, creased at multiple angles, worn soft with handling. She set it on the table between them. He didn't touch it yet. "My dad kept a list," she said, "in his things. He had notes about the club, meeting times, this diner." She paused. "He kept them updated. The last entry was about 8 months ago." 8 months ago. Ghost had still been updating a list of Brotherhood contact information 8 months before he died. Had been keeping a thread, thin as wire, that connected him to the people he'd come from. Crow looked at the envelope. "Can I open this?" "That's why I brought it." He picked it up. The paper inside was a single folded sheet, not a formal letter, just a page torn from a yellow legal pad. The handwriting was Ghost's. He knew it the way you knew the handwriting of people you'd shared a life with. The specific slant of the letters, the way the G's curved, the lowercase e's that always looked slightly rushed. He read it twice. The message was short. A few sentences explaining who Lena was, who Sarah was, and what condition they were in. And then, at the bottom, in handwriting that pressed harder on the paper than the rest. The kind of pressure that meant the hand behind it was fighting something while it wrote, "If I'm gone and they need help, find my brothers. Tell Crow I never stopped counting them. Tell him I'm sorry I didn't call. And tell him I trust him with the only thing I ever loved more than the road." Crow set the letter down on the table. He didn't let anything show on his face, but the pressure in his chest had become something significant, something he was going to have to address privately later when none of his brothers were looking at him. He looked at Lena. "Tell me about your mom," he said. And she did. Sarah Cole was 38 years old and had been a respiratory therapist until 14 months ago, when the illness she'd been treating in others had turned and taken root in her instead. Hypersensitivity pneumonitis, her immune system attacking her own lung tissue, a condition that had progressed faster than the initial diagnosis suggested it would. She'd left work 6 months ago. The medical bills had arrived in waves, each one larger than the last, each one representing a number that Sarah had tried to manage on savings, on a disability claim that moved through the bureaucratic machinery at its own pace, on credit that had run dry 4 months ago. Their apartment in Reading was 2 rooms and a bathroom, the kind of building where management changed hands every few years, and the new owners always discovered that the maintenance the old owners claimed to have done wasn't real. The heat came and went. The mold in the bathroom wall was a recurring problem. Their landlord, a man named Victor Kane, who owned 11 properties across 2 counties and operated all of them on the principle that people with nowhere else to go would tolerate anything, had been threatening eviction since October. Not because they were behind on rent, because the building was being sold to a developer, and the developer wanted vacant possession, and Victor Kane had decided that the most efficient way to achieve vacant possession was to make the remaining tenants' lives difficult enough that they chose to leave. Sarah Cole was attached to an oxygen concentrator 18 hours a day and fighting her own immune system and Victor Kane's eviction notices simultaneously. "Where is she right now?" Crow asked. "Home," Lena said. "She doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm at my friend Maya's house." "How far is Maya's house from your apartment?" 4 blocks. "Does Maya know?" Lena looked at her hot chocolate. "Maya's mom knows I left. She said she wouldn't call my mom until morning. She said—" A pause. "She said she thought I was being brave, but I could tell she was scared for me." Crow looked at this 9-year-old child who had ridden a bus to Reading, convinced a truck driver to take her to the county line, walked 3 miles through a blizzard in canvas sneakers, and walked into a room full of large and intimidating strangers with the specific confidence of someone who had already decided that the worst possible outcome was acceptable, because the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. He thought about Ghost, about who Ghost had been, the recklessness that looked like courage, the stubbornness that looked like faith, the specific quality of not backing down from things that needed doing, even when the doing was expensive. Lena Cole was her father's daughter. "Okay," Crow said. He folded Ghost's letter carefully and put it in his inside jacket pocket. He looked up at his brothers. They were watching him, all of them, even the ones at the far table, even Hector, who'd been still as stone since the moment Lena had said her father's name. They were watching him the way they always watched him when something needed deciding, not because he had all the answers, but because someone needed to be the one to say the thing first. And that had always been his job. "Somebody call Stitch," he said. "Tell him to bring his kit." Nobody asked why. Stitch, who had not been at the diner tonight, had gone home early with a headache, picked up on the second ring. The phone call lasted 45 seconds. Wrench caught Crow's eye and gave him a very small nod. This was the nod that meant, "Whatever this is, I'm with you." It was not a complicated communication. It didn't need to be. Crow turned back to Lena. "Does your mom have a doctor? Someone managing her care?" "Dr. Reyes at Mercy General, but she missed her last 2 appointments because—" Lena stopped. "Because of the bills," Crow said. She nodded. "Okay." He pulled out his phone. "I'm going to make some calls. You stay here. Darlene's going to get you something to eat. You're not going back to Reading tonight. Not in this weather." He looked at her. "Is that a problem?" She shook her head. No drama. No relief. Even, or if there was relief, she was managing it the way she managed everything, privately, internally, with a control that was going to cost her later in ways she didn't know yet. He stood up from the table. He walked to the far end of the diner where the payphone that no longer worked sat beside the rack of road maps that no one bought anymore, and he stood in that corner with his back to the room and his hand over his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Because he was not going to fall apart about this in front of anyone. Not tonight, not when there was work to do. But Ghost's handwriting was still behind his eyes. "Tell him I trust him with the only thing I ever loved more than the road." He had written that, and then he had died on a county road 400 miles south of here, on a patch of black ice, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, alone. Crow pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes for 3 seconds. Then he took out his phone and started making calls. The next 2 hours moved the way serious hours moved, quickly inside themselves, slow in memory. Stitch arrived in 30 minutes, blowing snow off his jacket, and sat beside Lena long enough to check her fingers and toes for cold damage, none, she'd been lucky, and get enough information about Sarah's condition to start forming a picture. Jimmy Rios drove to the 24-hour pharmacy 15 miles east and came back with supplies, warm socks, a better jacket in what he guessed was Lena's size, hand warmers, basic nutrition bars, the kind of improvisational kindness that young men who'd grown up with nothing were better at than people who'd never had to think about it. Bear, without anyone asking him to, went to Darlene's kitchen and came back with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast that Lena ate with the concentrated focus of someone who hadn't had a real meal in a while and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Crow worked the phone. I had contacts. a respiratory specialist at UC Davis Medical Center, who owed him a conversation, not a favor, but a conversation, which was the same thing differently labeled. He had a friend in Reading who knew the property development scene well enough to start pulling on the thread of Victor Kane's portfolio. He had 12 years of built relationships with people in uncomfortable positions all across Northern California who respected the Ravens not because they feared them, which some people did, but because the Ravens had a reputation for keeping their word and not making problems they hadn't been invited to solve. By midnight, he had 3 things he hadn't had at 10. A preliminary consult scheduled with the pulmonologist for Monday morning, a lawyer's name associated with Victor Kane's development company, and a general picture of a family in a specific kind of collapse. Not sudden, not dramatic, but the slow structural kind where one thing gives out, and then another, until the whole edifice is held up by nothing except the sheer determination of one person who refuses to stop. Sarah Cole, from what he could piece together, had been holding up her family with her bare hands for 14 months while her lungs turned against her. Her husband had been gone for 3 of those months, and apparently, at some point in those 3 months, her 9-year-old daughter had decided that the family needed help and that she was going to go get it herself. He went back to the table. Lena was sitting with Bear, enormous, gentle Bear, who was showing her something on his phone, some video of a dog doing something improbably athletic, and she was watching it with an expression that was the first fully unguarded thing Crow had seen on her face. Not quite a smile. Not a smile. The face of a child allowing herself briefly to just be a child. He slid into the booth across from them. Bear looked up and, with the uncanny social awareness that large quiet men sometimes develop, found a reason to be somewhere else within 10 seconds. Crow looked at Lena. "I talked to some people," he said. "We're going to go see your mom tomorrow." She looked at him carefully. "She's going to be upset that I came." "Probably." "She's going to say we don't need help." "Probably." "She's very stubborn." Ghost was stubborn, Crow said. Stubborn people usually end up together. Something moved across Lena's face. Quick, uncontrolled, the flash of a grief that hadn't finished arriving yet. She pressed her mouth flat and looked at the table. He let her have that moment. Outside, the storm was still coming. The pines were bending in the wind. The snow against the windows had built into proper drifts now, obscuring the lower half of the glass, making the diner feel like a specific kind of shelter. Not safe because nothing was coming, but safe because the people inside it had decided to hold the line. "He talked about you," Lena said. She was still looking at the table. "Not a lot, but sometimes." Crow waited. "He called you Crow," she said. "He said you were the kind of person who—" She stopped. Started again. "He said if he was ever in real trouble, you were the person he'd call, and that he never called because he was always trying not to be in real trouble." She looked up. "He said that like it was a joke, but I don't think it was." Crow looked at Ghost's daughter, who was 9 years old and already understood the difference between things said as jokes and things that aren't, and he thought, "You have no idea how right you are." "It wasn't," he said. The diner had mostly emptied by now. It was past midnight, the storm had chased the regular customers home hours ago, and Darlene had given up any pretense of normal business, and was sitting at the counter with a cup of her own terrible coffee and a crossword puzzle, periodically glancing toward the back tables with the kind of careful non-attention that was its own form of respect. The Ravens were still there, all 10 of them, or rather 8, since Stitch had gone out to check the bikes and Jimmy had gone with him, redistributed around the tables in the particular arrangement of men who weren't leaving but didn't need to be performing wakefulness. Hector was sitting with Patch in the far booth, not talking. They'd been not talking for the better part of an hour. There was a specific texture to the silence between men who'd been through things together. It wasn't empty. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of shared weight being carried without the need for commentary. Crow watched them for a moment. He thought about Ghost, about the last time he'd actually seen him, 7 years ago, at a mutual friend's wedding in Sacramento. One of those brief encounters that felt like it should be the beginning of something, but then wasn't. Ghost had looked good, happy even, or something close enough to it that the difference was hard to see. He'd shown Crow a photograph on his phone. Sarah, laughing, mid-sentence, caught in a moment she hadn't been posing for. "She doesn't know I take pictures of her," Ghost had said. "She'd tell me to stop." He'd been grinning when he said it. That specific grin, private, lit from somewhere inside, That meant he was thinking about something good. Crow had said, "She sounds like someone worth keeping." Ghost had put the phone away. "Yeah," he'd said, "she really is." And then the wedding reception had pulled them in different directions and they hadn't spoken properly again. And then there had been postcards. And then there had been silence. And then a highway patrol officer with the right words. He hadn't called. He should have called. He'd thought about it. Many times over the years he'd thought, I should reach out to Ghost. I should make sure he's okay. I should... And then something else would come up, some club business or personal business, or the ordinary entropy of living a life that was already too full of immediate things, and the thought would get filed away and the call wouldn't happen. That was a weight he was going to carry for a while. He looked at Lena, who had fallen asleep in the booth. Not peacefully, not curled up in the comfortable way of children in safe places, but upright, still slightly braced, her chin dropping to her chest with the exhausted surrender of someone who'd been holding themselves together through willpower. And the willpower had finally run out. She looked young when she slept. She looked the age she actually was. He took his jacket off and spread it over her, gently, not disturbing her. Bear, from across the room, watched him do this and said nothing. Outside, a gust of wind hit the diner like a fist. The windows rattled. The neon sign above the door, that red crow's nest with its missing apostrophe, flickered once, twice, held. Crow sat back in the booth across from Ghost's sleeping daughter and looked at the envelope she'd carried through a blizzard. He thought about the kind of faith it took to do what she'd done. To walk 3 miles in canvas sneakers through a snowstorm towards strangers based on a note her dead father had written and the specific conviction that the note was true. He thought about what Ghost had trusted him with, and he thought about what he was going to find tomorrow in Reading. A woman he'd never met, dying slowly in a collapsing apartment, who had no idea that her daughter had walked through a blizzard to find 11 men who owed a debt they hadn't known they still had. He thought about Victor Kane. That was a thought with edges. He let it sit. Around 3 in the morning, the storm began to quiet. The wind dropped first, that characteristic shift from violence to the heavy stillness of deep accumulated snow. The diner's heating system, which had been laboring all night, finally caught up to itself. The room got warmer. The windows began to clear from the inside, the condensation retreating. Stitch came back in, stamping snow from his boots, and reported that all 10 bikes were covered and secure, that the parking lot was drifted but navigable come morning, and that the temperature outside was sitting at 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sky had the look of something that was done for now but wasn't promising anything. Crow nodded. "Get some sleep," he said. "We ride at 7. Nobody asked where. They already knew. Or they knew enough. Wrench caught his eye again. That small nod again. The one that meant, "I'm with you." This time there was something else in it. Something that was the acknowledgement of what was in front of them, the weight of what Ghost had trusted them with. The fact that they were all sitting in a diner at 3 in the morning in a blizzard with a 9-year-old girl asleep under a leather jacket, because her father had written their address on a piece of paper and trusted that it would mean something. It meant something. Crow looked at Ghost's letter in his inside pocket. He could feel it there, the slight stiffness of the yellow legal pad paper against his chest. And then he looked at Lena's face, slack with exhausted sleep, the grief in it invisible now but not gone, just resting. He pulled out his phone. He opened the contacts list. He scrolled to Victor Kane's name. He'd gotten the number from his contact in Reading, just tonight, added it to his phone with the particular calm efficiency of a man who is already thinking 3 moves ahead, and he looked at it for a long moment. Then he put the phone away. Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight was for the storm to finish passing and for Ghost's daughter to sleep in warmth, for the first time in what Crow suspected was a long while, and for 11 men to sit with a grief they'd thought was settled and understand that it wasn't, that it had just been waiting for a 9-year-old girl in canvas sneakers to walk through a diner door and give it a shape they could actually do something about. Tomorrow was for Reading. Tomorrow was for Sarah Cole, who didn't know they were coming. Tomorrow was for the beginning of whatever this was going to cost them. But right now, at 3:14 in the morning, with the storm going quiet outside and the neon sign flickering its steady red light through the cleared windows, Crow sat across from Ghost's daughter and kept watch the way he'd been keeping watch over things, and people that needed watching for 30 years. Without drama, without announcement, without the expectation of thanks. That was the job. That had always been the job. He didn't see the pickup truck that pulled into the far end of the parking lot at 3:40 and idled there for 4 minutes with its lights off before reversing out. He didn't see it. But Patch did, and Patch said nothing about it yet, only watched it go, his eyes tracking it through the cleared lower edge of the window, with the practiced calm of a man who'd learned to note threats before responding to them. He would mention it to Crow in the morning. He would mention it quietly, matter-of-factly, the way you mention things that might mean nothing and might mean everything. Because Patch had been around long enough to know that the worst things rarely announce themselves. They idled at the edge of the light. And they waited. The morning came in gray and cold and without apology. Crow was awake before the light changed. Not because he'd slept and woken, but because he hadn't slept at all. Not really. Just sat in the corner booth with his back against the wall and his eyes moving between the parking lot window and Ghost Daughter and the middle distance where thoughts lived when they were too heavy to put down and too unresolved to let go. At some point around 4:30, Darlene had brought him a fresh cup of the terrible coffee without being asked, and set it down without comment and gone back to her counter, and he'd been grateful in the specific way you were grateful for things that cost someone nothing but meant that they were paying attention. The storm had finished its business overnight. What it left behind was the particular silence of deep accumulated snow. Not peaceful, exactly, just muffled. The world's ordinary sounds buried under 6 inches of white that made everything look cleaner than it was. The parking lot was drifted in long diagonal ridges where the wind had pushed the snow against the bike's tarps, against the diner's front wall, against the base of the dead pine at the lot's far edge. The sky above was a flat, low gray that wasn't done thinking about more snow, but hadn't decided yet. Crow was standing at the window with his coffee when Patch came to stand beside him. They looked at the parking lot together for a moment. "Tell me about the truck," Crow said. Patch's reflection in the glass didn't change expression. 341. Dark blue or black, hard to tell in that light. F-250, late model. Parked at the far end, lights off, engine running, sat there 4 minutes, maybe 4.5. Then reversed out and took the county road east. Plates? Too far, too dark. Crow turned the coffee mug in his hands. "Anyone I know drive a truck like that?" "Victor Kane drives a black F-250, Patch said. Registered to his property management company. I looked him up last night." The information settled between them. "How would he know we were here?" Crow said. "He might not know who we are," Patch said. "He might just know someone talked to his lawyer. Someone started pulling on threads of his portfolio last night. He's the kind of man who pays people to tell him when threads get pulled." Crow thought about that. About a landlord who preyed on sick women in collapsing apartments making calls at midnight to find out who'd been asking questions. About a truck sitting in a dark parking lot 4 minutes, engine running, doing its math. "Wake the others," Crow said. "We leave at 7. Lena woke up at 6:15, disoriented, one hand going instinctively to the jacket covering her before she'd fully processed where she was. Then her eyes found Crow at the table across from her and she went still, that same controlled stillness. And he watched her run through the previous night in her memory and arrive at the present moment. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I slept enough." She looked at him with ghost eyes and said nothing, which meant she didn't believe him, which was accurate. "We're leaving for Reading at 7, he said. "You're going to ride with Wrench. He's got a cab on his truck. I need you to call your mom before we go." She tensed. "What do I say?" "Tell her you're coming home. Tell her you're bringing some of your dad's people." "She's going to—" Lena stopped. "She doesn't like accepting help." "Help. I know." "She's going to say no. Let her say no first. That's her right." He met her eyes. "And then we're going anyway." Lena looked at him for a long moment. In that look, Crow could see the calculation happening, the assessment of him, of whether this was real, of whether trusting it was the kind of mistake her 9 years had already taught her, could be expensive. He didn't push. He let her look. Whatever she needed to see, it was there or it wasn't. "Okay," she said. The phone call lasted 6 minutes. He didn't listen, walked to the other end of the diner to give her the wall of privacy, but he could hear the shape of it without the words. The long pause at the beginning. The quick defensive cadence of a mother who'd been caught off guard and had gone immediately to the position of, "I'm fine, we're fine, you shouldn't have." Then a longer silence from Lena's end, steady, not backing down. Then something that changed in the room's texture, quieter, flatter, which was either the argument getting worse or the resistance starting to crack. She came to find him when it was done. Her eyes were dry, but the space around them was tight. "She's scared," Lena said. "Of us?" "Of needing people." He nodded. Did she say we could come? She said she can't stop us. Good enough. The ravens loaded up in the early gray morning, the sound of the bikes coming alive one by one in the cold air. That specific sequence of Harley ignitions that was part mechanical, part something else. A sound that carried its own weight and always had. The cold hit hard at first start, the engines turning over with the particular reluctance of machines being woken before they're ready, but they caught and steadied and settled into that low, rolling thunder that Crow had been hearing for 30 years and still, in the right moment, felt in his chest rather than his ears. Lena sat in the front of Wrench's extended cab truck, which smelled of motor oil and old coffee cups, and, inexplicably, cinnamon. Wrench was a man of hidden domestic tendencies, and watched the bikes pull out onto the county road with an expression that Crow, passing on his Harley, caught through the windshield. Not fear. Not quite awe. Something more complicated than either. Recognition, maybe. He looked away and focused on the road. The convoy made Reading in just under 3 hours, the county road feeding into the highway where the snow was thinner and the sky had begun to lighten toward a pale, unconvincing winter sun. They rode mostly quiet, the kind of road silence that wasn't absence but presence. 10 men in leather vests on Harley-Davidson's processing. Something that none of them had found words for yet and weren't going to find words for on a highway in the cold. Ghost's name hadn't been spoken out loud since last night, but it was there, riding with them, in the particular weight of the air between the bikes. Crow thought about the truck in the parking lot. He thought about Victor Kane. He thought about a man who identified himself through his properties, who understood people the way landlords understood tenants, as occupants, as revenue streams, as problems to be managed or removed. He thought about what kind of man looked at a woman on supplemental oxygen and a 9-year-old child and saw leverage. He throttled up slightly, moving through the cold air, and let the thought sit. Sarah Cole's apartment building was on the east side of Reading, in a neighborhood that wasn't dangerous exactly, but had that particular look of a place where the investment had stopped. The building was 3 stories, beige stucco that had gone grayish-green with weather. The parking lot cracked and heaved, the mailboxes in the lobby missing several doors. A chain-link fence along the east side was leaning at a 15-degree angle away from the building as if it had been thinking about leaving for a while. The landscaping, if it had ever been landscaping, was now bare dirt and dead ornamental grass, half buried in yesterday's snow. The Iron Ravens pulled into the parking lot like a tide coming in. 10 Harleys, 1 truck. The sound of the engines in the enclosed parking lot was considerable. Curtains moved in several windows. A man in a first-floor unit opened his door, looked at what was in the parking lot, and closed it again. Crow killed his engine. In the sudden quiet, he could hear the building's heating system laboring, could hear a TV somewhere, could hear distantly the sound of a dog objecting to the new arrivals from behind a closed door. He dismounted, pulled off his helmet, looked up at the building's face. 3rd floor, east side, Lena had told him. Apartment 3E. He looked at his brothers. Just me and Stitch first, he said. Everybody else stays down here. Nobody argued. But he saw the shift in Bear's expression. Not disagreement, just the concern of a large man who processed threat assessment instinctively. He caught Bear's eye and gave him a small flat look that meant, I know what I'm doing. Bear subsided. Crow and Stitch went up the exterior stairwell. Metal grating, the paint peeled back to bare rust at every footfall point, the railing wobbling slightly under Crow's hand when he tested it. The 3rd floor walkway was open to the weather, a concrete ledge behind an aluminum railing that someone had repaired at one point with zip ties. The snow on the walkway had been scraped, recently, by the look of the thin white residue left behind. Someone had shoveled this morning. He stopped at 3E. Knocked. The woman who opened the door was not what he'd been expecting, which told him he'd been building an expectation without realizing it. He'd been expecting someone diminished by illness, gray, soft, hollowed out. Sarah Cole was 38 years old, and she was thin in the way that serious illness made people thin, the muscle memory of a body that had been working hard for a long time. But her eyes were sharp and direct and currently furious, and she was standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame and the other holding the clear plastic tubing of a nasal cannula that ran back to the concentrator behind her. And she was looking at Crow the way people looked at things they'd braced themselves to deal with and were not going to let touch them if they could help it. She was also, undeniably, beautiful. Not in a way that was soft or inviting, but in the way that some faces were beautiful because they were entirely themselves. No performance, no pretense. Every line of them, the product of having lived something real. He could see, looking at her, exactly what Ghost had seen. "Sarah Cole," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was careful, controlled. She'd done her research since Lena's call, had found his name, had probably spent the last 2 hours working out what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it, had positioned herself in this doorway with her hand on the frame so he would understand that she was not automatically stepping aside. "I'm going to say this once, and I need you to hear it." "Go ahead." "I didn't ask for this. My daughter made a decision I didn't sanction. Whatever Ethan wrote in that letter, I need you to understand I am not a project. I'm not something to be fixed or saved. I've been managing my situation, and I will continue to manage my situation, and I appreciate that you drove a long way, but how long has the heat been off?" Stitch said. She stopped. Stitch, who had been standing slightly behind Crow's right shoulder, not threatening, just present, was looking past her into the apartment. Not intrusively, just observing, the way a man with medical training observed environments, noting details. The way his brain had been trained to note them. The visible breath in the interior air, the extra blankets layered on the couch, the secondary space heater plugged into the wall behind the concentrator, the specific pallor of Sarah Cole's face that was partly illness and partly cold. 3 days, she said. Her jaw tightened. "The boiler. I reported it. Management said they were working on it." "Victor Kane's management company," Crow said. The tiniest flicker behind her eyes. "Yes. The same management company that sent you an eviction notice in October. That matter is—" She stopped. "I have a lawyer handling it. Legal aid," Crow said. Not a question. He knew the shape of it. The volunteer attorney juggling 30 cases, the response times measured in weeks, the paperwork that moved at the speed of good intentions and insufficient staffing. "How far along?" Her chin lifted slightly. "We have a court date, in February." February. He looked at her. He kept his voice even and his face neutral because he understood that this woman needed to be met with steadiness, not pity, and that pity right now would send her back behind the door. "Can I come in?" A long beat. She stepped back. The apartment was small and cold and ruthlessly organized. Everything in it had been positioned with care. Not the care of decoration, but the care of someone managing limited space and limited energy. Someone who'd thought hard about what mattered and put the things that mattered where they needed to be. The concentrator was beside the couch, the tubing running in a neat loop along the baseboard to keep it out of the walking path. The kitchen was clean in the way of people who couldn't afford to let it not be. There were drawings on the refrigerator, Lena's, obviously, pencil and marker. The drawings of a child who paid attention, detailed faces, accurate proportions, the kind of art that came from spending a lot of time looking at things carefully. On the small table beside the concentrator, a photograph. Ghost, younger, maybe 35, laughing at something off camera, the raven tattoo visible on his forearm, a particular aliveness in his expression. Crow looked at it and looked away. Stitch was already moving through the space in that quiet, professional way of his, not intrusively, just noting. He checked the temperature on the secondary space heater. He looked at the concentrator's display. He glanced at the prescription bottles on the kitchen counter, with the speed of someone reading a language he was fluent in. "Your pulmonologist," he said. "When did you last see them?" 6 weeks ago. Flat. "The prednisone. Are you still on 40 milligrams?" She looked at him. "Who are you?" "Navy corpsman. 8 years. He met her eye without defensiveness. "I'm not trying to take over your care. I just want to know what we're working with." Something shifted in the room's tension, very slightly, very carefully. 30, she said. "They tapered me down. The prednisone." She paused. "And the azathioprim. I've been on both for 7 months." Stitch nodded once, the nod of someone filing information. "The missed appointments. I know." A single word carrying a tremendous weight, the specific tone of someone who was absolutely aware of what they weren't doing and why they weren't doing it, and didn't want to be told. Because being told meant acknowledging the gap between where they were and where they needed to be, and that gap was large enough already. Crow had been standing near the door, letting Stitch work, watching Sarah Cole navigate this with the particular grace of a woman who was exhausted and proud and scared and not going to show any of those things if she could help it. He thought about what Lena had said. She doesn't like accepting help. He thought about Ghost, about a man stubborn enough to walk away from everything he'd known in order to build something different. He'd found someone with the same architecture. Your daughter walked 3 miles through a blizzard last night, Crow said. Sarah closed her eyes. Just for a second. In canvas sneakers, he said, in 12-degree weather, on a county road with no shoulder. I know, quieter this time. She did it because she was afraid for you and she ran out of other options. He paused. She's 9. I know. The word was coming out differently each time. Not defensive now, just honest. Just the sound of a mother sitting with something that hurt. I'm not telling you that to make you feel bad, he said. I'm telling you because it tells me something about how bad things actually are right now, today, in this apartment. Because a kid who's okay doesn't do that. A kid who's okay doesn't memorize club contact information and bus schedules and figure out how to get a truck driver to take her to the county line. Sarah opened her eyes. They were wet at the edges, but her jaw was set. What do you want? She said. It came out hard. What is it that you actually want from us? Because I've been managing, I know you've been managing. His voice stayed level. And I know what managing looks like when you're doing it by yourself with no margin left. I've seen it before. He paused. Ghost managed by himself too. Right up until he couldn't. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. She turned away from him, walked to the window, stood with her back to the room, her hand pressing flat against the glass, looking out at the gray parking lot where the Ravens' bikes were visible, like dark shapes in the thin snow. Crow waited. Stitch caught his eye from across the room and gave the smallest of shrugs. Your call. He kept your address, Sarah said. She was still facing the window. Her voice had changed, not softer exactly, but stripped of its defensive architecture. He updated it. He didn't tell me he was doing it. I found it after... She stopped. I found it in his things. After. Her hand pressed harder against the glass. He kept a folder. Notes about the club. Meeting times. This diner. He updated it right up until... She turned around. Her eyes were dry again. She'd won that particular fight with herself. He never told me why he stopped calling. The silence that followed had texture. Crow said nothing for a moment. There was a version of this conversation where he said the comfortable thing, where he gave her the explanation that made Ghost silence a loving choice, a protection, a deliberate decision to build a clean, separate life without the weight of the old one pressing into it. That version was probably partly true, but she wasn't asking for comfort. She was asking for the honest shape of it. I was ashamed, Crow said. Not of you. Not of Lana. Of himself. He looked at her steadily. He left the brotherhood clean. No debt, no drama. But that doesn't mean it felt clean to him. He'd built his whole sense of himself around those men, around that life. And then he walked away from it, and he'd spend the next 6 years being grateful every day that he did, and guilty every day that he did, and he didn't know how to call Crow and talk about his daughter's drawings on the refrigerator and say, I don't miss the road without it sounding like a betrayal, and he didn't know how to call and say I do miss the road without it sounding like regret, and so he didn't call. He sent postcards. He paused. That's the honest answer. He loved you, and he loved Lena, and he loved the life he built. And he also never stopped feeling like he owed something he couldn't pay. And so he kept his distance and maintained the thread and told himself he'd figure it out later. His voice stayed level. And then there wasn't a later. Sarah Cole looked at him for a long time. That sounds like him, she said. Yeah. Another silence. Less hard this time. The kind of silence that has something inside it instead of nothing. The heat's been off for 3 days, she said. The building super told me it would be fixed yesterday. It wasn't. She turned slightly, looking at the window, at the parking lot. Kane's been trying to get us out for 4 months. First it was the lease renewal. He wanted to double the rent. Then it was maintenance issues that he blamed on tenant modification. Then it was the eviction notice in October. My lawyer, my legal aid attorney, filed an emergency response, which bought us some time, but the court date in February. She stopped. Kane has a real estate attorney. A good one. I have a third-year law student who's very sincere. I know a lawyer in Sacramento who handles tenant rights, Crow said. A real one. Not a favor. I'll pay the retainer. She started to object. It's a debt, he said, not charity. Your husband was my brother. That means what happens to his family has to happen to ours first. The word brother moved across her face the way the word ghost had moved across it. The same slight flinching, the same effort not to flinch. She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know how to do this, she said. I don't know how to... She gestured, not at anything specific. Let people in. I've been on my own since I was 19. I've been managing since before Ethan. This is... She pressed her lips together. This goes against everything I know. I know it does. He looked at her directly. Do it anyway. She looked at him. At the raven tattoo on his forearm. Ghost tattoo. Its twin. She looked at it for a long time. Lena's downstairs, she said, with Wrench. He's got heat in the truck. She nodded. Once. Small. The nod of someone crossing a line they'd been standing at for a while. Tell her to come up. He pulled out his phone and sent the text. I thought the hard part was over. He would understand later that it was only beginning, that this moment, Sarah Cole letting go of the door frame and stepping back from the window and saying, tell her to come up, was not the resolution but the trigger. That saying yes to the Ravens was what put them in Victor Kane's line of sight in a way that a 9-year-old's bus ride and a legal aid filing hadn't. He didn't know that yet. I knew it was cold. He knew the boiler had been off for 3 days, and the space heater wasn't enough. And Sarah's last appointment had been 6 weeks ago, and the court date was February, and a truck had sat in his parking lot at 3:40 in the morning with its lights off. He thought about the truck. He thought about Kane. I went to the window and looked down at the parking lot. His brothers were arranged around the bikes in the specific posture of men waiting. Not impatient, not restless, but watchful, each of them oriented slightly outward, the unconscious formation of people trained to hold a perimeter. Wrench's truck was parked nearest the entrance. Through the cab window, he could see Lena's profile, looking up at her phone. He watched his brothers for a moment. He'd been running this chapter for 9 years. He'd taken it through membership disputes, through the death of 2 brothers, through a territorial conflict with another club that had resolved itself in the way territorial conflicts between motorcycle clubs tended to resolve, slowly, through attrition and negotiation and the occasional deliberate display of presence. He'd built something here that he was proud of, not in a boastful way, but in the deep, quiet way of a man who'd put real work into something that mattered. He thought, Ghost trusted you with this. He also thought, you should have called him. Both things were true simultaneously, and that was something he was going to have to learn to carry. Lena came up the stairs 2 at a time, the way kids climbed stairs, and was through the apartment door before it had fully opened. He heard rather than saw the reunion, the particular silence before it, and then Sarah's voice, low and broken-edged, and Lena's voice, which didn't break at all but was thinner than it had been. And then just the sound of 2 people holding on to each other in a cold apartment while an oxygen concentrator hummed in the background. Crow stepped out onto the walkway. He lit a cigarette. The first one since last night. He'd forgotten he'd been wanting one. And leaned on the railing and looked at the gray-redding sky and the parking lot below and the ravens standing among the bikes in the light snow, and he smoked it in the particular focused way he smoked when he was working through something. Stitch came out behind him, stood beside him, didn't speak for a moment. She needs to see Reyes this week, Stitch said. Not February, this week. The taper schedule she's on needs to be evaluated. She's been cold for 3 days. That's physiological stress on top of everything else. I'll make it happen. She's managing better than she should be able to, Stitch said. She's also more depleted than she's letting on. The kind of tired that doesn't come from not sleeping enough. It comes from running on reserve for too long. He paused. She's been white-knuckling it for months. Crow smoked. The boiler, he said. Building super said yesterday. Didn't fix it. I want someone to talk to the super today. Not me. Someone with a friendly face. Jimmy, Stitch said. Jimmy, he nodded. And I want to know who the building super reports to, what the chain looks like between the super and Kane. Stitch looked at him sidelong. You're building a picture. I'm always building a picture. Below, the parking lot. A car pulled in. A sedan, middle-aged driver, first-floor resident by the look of him, who looked at the ravens and their bikes and then looked away in that deliberate way of people who'd decided that not seeing something was safer than seeing it. He parked, got out, went inside without making eye contact. Crow watched him go and thought, this building is full of people doing that. looking away. Because looking costs something. I understood the calculation. He just couldn't respect it. He came back inside. The apartment was warmer in feeling, if not in temperature. Lena was on the couch beside Sarah. Sarah's arm around her, and the oxygen tubing ran between them in a domestic arrangement that was clearly practiced, clearly habitual, the unconscious accommodation of a family that had learned to live around a medical necessity. Sarah's free hand was in Lena's hair, smoothing it, the automatic parental gesture of comfort that bypassed words. She looked up when Crow came in. Her eyes were still dry, but the skin around them was different now. Softer, more tired, the fortress walls down enough to show the work they'd been doing. "What do you need?" she said. "Not what do you want. Not what are you offering. What do you need?" The question of someone who'd spent their working life asking it of patients, who defaulted to it under stress. "First thing is the boiler," Crow said. "I'm sending someone to talk to your building super today. I want heat in this building by tonight." "And if Kane pushes back?" "Then we have a different conversation." He sat down in the chair across from the couch. "Second thing is Dr. Reyes. I need an appointment this week. Stitch knows someone at UC Davis. We may end up moving your care there, but that's a later conversation. First thing is this week, somewhere." She started to speak. "I know about the bills," he said. "Don't worry about the bills. That's not, I can't just let you pay my medical bills. You're not letting me do anything. I'm doing it." He held her gaze. "This isn't generosity, Sarah. Ghost was a brother. His family is our family. This is how it works." Something complicated moved through her expression. She looked at Lena, who was watching this exchange with the careful, serious attention she brought to everything. "Tell him, Mom," Lena said quietly. Sarah looked at her daughter. "Lena, tell him about Kane." The room changed. It was subtle. The shift in Sarah's expression, from resistance to something heavier, more complicated. The look of someone who's been deciding how much of a thing to reveal and has just decided to reveal more of it. "He's been escalating," she said, "beyond the eviction. 2 weeks ago, someone filed a complaint with the city against my lease, claiming lease violations. Building inspector came. There were no violations, but it went on record." She paused. "Last week, my car was towed from the parking lot. My space. My name on the lease. They said there was a new parking policy, effective immediately, no prior notice." Another pause. "And 4 days ago, I received a letter from Kane's attorney claiming I owe back fees for what he's calling excessive utility use related to the oxygen concentrator." The silence in the room was very still. Crow looked at her. He felt the thing in his chest that had been a cold dropping sensation the night before reorganize itself into something more specific, more contained, more dangerous. He thought about a truck sitting in a parking lot at 3:40 in the morning. He thought about Kane identifying, before Crow had even identified it himself, that someone was pulling threads. "How long has the escalation been going on?" he said. 6 weeks, maybe 7. She pressed her lips together. "Since I filed the emergency response through my lawyer. Since I stopped looking like someone who was going to leave quietly." Crow nodded slowly. "I was putting the picture together now. Not just Kane's campaign against Sarah. That part was a pattern he recognized, the particular cruelty of a man with resources using them to grind down a person without them. But the timing. The truck in the parking lot had not been Kane discovering that someone was asking questions about him. The truck in the parking lot had been Kane already knowing, already watching, already 3 moves into a game that Crow was only now sitting down at. This wasn't just a landlord who'd gotten greedy. This was a man who was organized. He stood up. "I'll be back," he said. He went outside. On the walkway, he called Hector. Hector picked up on the first ring. "What do you need?" "Victor Kane, F-250, black or dark blue, late model. I want someone to find out where he's been in the last 12 hours. A pause. "You think he was watching?" "I think he drove out to the Crow's Nest last night and sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes with his lights off." Another pause. "I think he already knew someone was asking about him before I made a single call." "That means he has someone inside," Hector said, "or someone adjacent." Crow looked at the parking lot below. His brothers were still there. Bear, who had positioned himself subtly but undeniably between the building entrance and the street. Lobo and Cal, who had drifted to the lot's perimeter without appearing to. Patch, who was sitting on his bike looking at his phone but was not actually looking at his phone. "How fast can you find out?" "Few hours," Hector said. "I know a guy at the county assessor's office. And I know someone who works at the title company that handles Kane's portfolio transfers. Do it. He hung up. He stood on the walkway with his hands on the railing and looked at the street beyond the parking lot. A gray street. Bare trees. A diner on the corner with a closed sign. The ordinary sad face of a neighborhood in winter. He thought about what Lena had said the night before. He said you were the kind of person he'd call if he was in real trouble. He thought about Ghost updating his address list 8 months before he died, maintaining the thread, keeping the information current. Not because he planned to use it, because he needed to know it was there. He thought about a father choosing to tell his daughter where to go if she ever had no one left. He lit another cigarette. Wrench appeared at the bottom of the stairwell, looking up. "We got a situation," he said. His voice was flat, which meant it was serious. Wrench's voice flatlined when things were serious, the natural dramatist in him giving way to the operational man. Crow came down the stairs. "Building super," Wrench said. He nodded toward the building's maintenance entrance on the south side. "I went to talk to him. Jimmy went with me." He paused. "He's scared. I mean, properly scared. He told us the boiler isn't broken." Crow looked at him. "He said he was instructed to shut it down and report it as a maintenance issue," Wrench said, "by Kane's property management office 4 days ago, specifically for the third floor east wing, which is specifically the section of the building where Sarah's apartment is." He met Crow's eyes. "There are 6 apartments on that wing, all of them occupied. 2 of them have elderly residents." The cold in Crow's chest was no longer a dropping sensation or a contained pressure. It was something else now, flat and clear and specific, the feeling that arrived when a situation clarified itself into the shape of what it actually was. Not a greedy landlord cutting corners, a deliberate campaign to make a sick woman and her daughter uninhabitable enough to leave. And the cold had been off for 3 days. "Where's the super now?" Crow said. "Jimmy's with him. He's—" Wrench paused. "He's afraid of losing his job. He's got a family. He told us Kane's attorney called him this morning, before we showed up, before we even hit the county line." Which meant Kane had known they were coming before they'd left the crow's nest. "Where did we get compromised?" Crow said. His voice was very quiet. Wrench looked at him steadily. "I've been thinking about that." He paused. "There's only one place it could have come from. Only one person outside the Brotherhood who knew we were coming to Reading this morning." Crow went still. "The lawyer in Sacramento," Wrench said. "You called him last night, 1:15 in the morning. You asked him to pull the thread on Kane's portfolio." Crow thought about that call. About the lawyer, a man named Preston Vale, who'd helped the Ravens with legal-adjacent matters twice in the past 6 years, who was competent and careful, and who he'd trusted with the call because he needed information fast. About the specific sequence. Crow calls Vale, Vale starts pulling, Kane gets a notification from someone inside Vale's network, from someone in the county assessor's pipeline, from someone watching his portfolio for exactly this kind of inquiry. About a truck sitting in a parking lot at 3:40 in the morning. "Kane has someone in Vale's orbit," Crow said. "That's what I think." He thought about the implications of that, about what it meant that Kane had built a network capable of identifying a midnight inquiry about his portfolio and deploying a physical response within 3 hours, about what that level of organization looked like, about the resources required to maintain it. "This is bigger than one building," Crow said. "Yeah," Wrench said. "I think it is." Above them, the sound of the apartment door opening. Lena appeared on the walkway, looking down at them. She'd put on the jacket Jimmy had bought her the night before, bright red, too big, her hands disappearing in the sleeves. She looked at Crow's face and read something in it that made her go very still. "Is my mom okay?" she said. "Your mom's fine," Crow said. "Get back inside." She didn't move. Something happened. "Lena." He kept his voice level. "Inside." She held his gaze for a long 3 count. Ghost's stubbornness, Ghost's refusal to be dismissed, and then went back through the door. He turned back to Wrench. "Get everyone inside the building," he said. "Not the apartment, the lobby. Now." Wrench was already moving. Crow looked at the street, at the ordinary winter street with its bare trees and its diner, with the closed sign and its gray sky that had been considering more snow since morning and was now making up its mind. He thought about the picture that was assembling itself, piece by piece, into a shape he recognized from enough years of life to know what it looked like when it was fully formed. Kane had known they were coming. Kane had known they were asking about him before they'd asked. And Kane had, in the 3 hours between the parking lot at 3:40 and this moment, called his building super and confirmed his instructions regarding the third-floor east wing boiler. Not because he was panicking, because he was sending a message. Crow thought about that message. He thought about what it said. I see you. I was here first. You walked into something you don't fully understand. He looked at the building super's maintenance door. He thought about 6 apartments in the east wing. He thought about elderly residents and a woman on supplemental oxygen and 3 days without heat and a 9-year-old girl in canvas sneakers. He thought about Victor Kane in a dark truck with his lights off, sitting at the edge of the parking lot, watching. And then, from the far end of the street, from the direction of the diner with the closed sign, a black F-250 turned the corner. It came slowly. No rush. The pace of a man who knew he had time. It rolled along the street parallel to the apartment building's parking lot, not turning in, just passing. The windows were tinted dark enough that the driver was a shape rather than a face. It passed. It didn't stop. It turned at the next corner and was gone. Bear, from the parking lot, had tracked it from the moment it appeared to the moment it disappeared. His hands were hanging loose at his sides. His face was absolutely still. Patch, who had been looking at his phone, was no longer looking at his phone. Crow stood at the base of the stairwell with the gray winter light and the smell of snow and exhaust and the particular cold of a Reading morning, and he understood, with complete clarity, that whatever this was, whatever Victor Kane had built, whatever network he was operating, whatever he was protecting or pursuing with this campaign against Sarah Cole and her 6-apartment East Wing and his early morning parking lot surveillance, it was not going to resolve itself quietly. Ghost had written, "Tell him I trust him with the only thing I ever loved more than the road." Crow thought, "You should have told me sooner, brother. You should have told me sooner, because whatever this man is, he didn't start with you." He turned and went inside. In the lobby, his brothers were gathering, leather and cold air, and the weight of 10 men who'd been waiting for direction in the particular patient way of people who already understood the situation had changed. He looked at each of them in turn. Bear, Patch, Wrench, Jimmy, Hector, who'd just come in from the east stairwell, his face carrying something. "Talk," Crow said to Hector. Hector's jaw was set. "I called my guy at the assessor's office from the parking lot. Off the record." He paused. "Kane's portfolio isn't 11 properties." The lobby was very quiet. "It's 43, Hector said, "across 4 counties. And the tenant complaint history—" He stopped, met Crow's eyes. "Sarah Cole isn't the first. There are 7 other tenants in the last 18 months who filed emergency responses to Kane's eviction campaigns. 3 of them dropped the cases and left. 2 of them had their vehicles towed, their utilities disrupted, and their lease violations filed the same week they filed their responses." Another pause, this one carrying weight. "One of them, a single mother in Sacramento, ended up in the hospital after a fall on an unshoveled walkway during a winter that her building's grounds crew had been told to skip." He let that land. Kane settled out of court, sealed terms. In the lobby of Sarah Cole's building, 11 members of the Iron Ravens motorcycle brotherhood stood in the cold, and nobody spoke for a long moment after Hector finished. The lobby held them, all 11, leather and cold breath, and the particular silence of men absorbing information that was rearranging itself into something larger than what they'd walked in with. The fluorescent light above the mailboxes buzzed and flickered. Someone had taped a handwritten notice to the wall beside the elevator. "Out of order. Use stairs." The tape was old. The elevator had been out for a while. Crow looked at Hector. "The woman in Sacramento. The fall. Walkway outside her apartment, Jerry, 14 months ago." Hector's voice was flat in the way it went flat when he was managing something. "She broke her wrist and her hip. She was 61 years old. She'd been fighting Kane's eviction for 9 weeks. And the settlement, sealed. But her attorney, the legal aid attorney, same system Sarah's using, filed a notation in the case record before the seal went through. Said the terms were, quote, substantially coercive given the plaintiff's circumstances." He paused. "She left the building 2 weeks after the settlement. Building's been redeveloped. High-end condominiums now." Crow turned this over. 43 properties. 4 counties. A pattern going back at least 18 months that was visible only if you were looking across all of them simultaneously, which nobody had been, because the complaints were filed in different jurisdictions, handled by different legal aid offices, none of which talked to each other. Each case looked like an individual landlord dispute. Together they looked like something with architecture. "He's not a landlord," Wrench said. He said it quietly, the way you said things when you were working them out in real time and didn't like where they were arriving. "He's a developer. He identifies properties in neighborhoods moving toward gentrification. He acquires them. He runs the tenants out through administrative pressure, utility manipulation, manufactured lease violations. And then he sells to development companies once the building is vacant. And the people who fight back," Patch said. "Escalation," Wrench said. "Targeted, organized, and specifically calibrated to the individual's vulnerabilities." He looked at Crow. "Single mother on supplemental oxygen. Unshoveled walkway in January. That's not coincidence. That's research." The lobby buzzer sounded, a flat, institutional tone. Crow looked at the panel. Nobody moved. It sounded again. Bear walked to the intercom. "Yeah," a voice from outside, male, careful. "I'm looking for a Maddox Mercer." Bear looked at Crow. Crow nodded once. "Come up," Bear said. He hit the door release. They heard the exterior door open. Footsteps on the lobby stairs. Single person, unhurried. The stairwell door opened and a man stepped through. I was around 45. Medium build, wearing a gray overcoat over a dark suit, no tie. He had the face of a man who delivered bad news professionally. Not callous, just practiced. The face of someone who'd learned to stay present while the room broke around him. He was carrying a manila folder. He looked at 11 bikers in a building lobby and absorbed it without apparent alarm. "Mr. Mercer?" he said. "Who are you?" Crow said. "My name is Daniel Foss. I'm an investigative journalist. I work for the Sacramento Examiner." He paused. "I've been investigating Victor Kane for 14 months. Another pause, smaller. "I came here because I picked up the inquiry on Kane's portfolio last night. Someone was pulling threads, and when I traced the direction of the pull, it led me to this building." He looked at Crow steadily. "I need to know why you're here, because I think we may be working on the same problem from different angles." The lobby held them all. Crow looked at this man, at his careful eyes, at the manila folder, at the practiced neutrality of his expression, and ran the calculation. A journalist who'd been on this story 14 months, which meant he'd started it 3 months after the woman in Sacramento fell on the unshoveled walkway, which meant he'd been watching Kane's pattern for over a year without being able to break it into print. "Show me what you have," Crow said. Foss opened the folder on the lobby's built-in parcel shelf. Photographs. Documents. A printed map of 4 counties with 43 property addresses marked in red. He turned to a page in the back. A photograph, printed from what looked like a security camera frame, grainy but legible. A black F-250, late model, in a parking lot at night. Parked 20 meters from the entrance of a building that Crow recognized as not this building. A different building, different county, same posture, lights off, engine running, watching. "This was taken 11 months ago," Foss said, "outside a building in Stockton. The tenant who photographed it filed it with her legal aid attorney as evidence of harassment. It was submitted to the court, and then the case settled and sealed before it could be examined." He paused. "The tenant's name was Maria Gutierrez. She was 44, single mother. She had a 9-year-old daughter." The air in the lobby did something. Crow felt it. The specific pressure shift of a room where multiple people have just made the same connection simultaneously. A 9-year-old daughter. He looked at Foss. "What happened to her?" Foss's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A tightening, controlled. "She left the building, took the settlement, relocated." He paused. "Her daughter was in school 1 block from the building. New school, new district after relocation. The daughter—" He stopped. "Tell me," Crow said. "The daughter started having attendance issues, then behavioral issues. Then, 8 months after the relocation, she stopped attending entirely." Foss closed the folder. "I tried to contact Maria Gutierrez 4 months ago. Her phone was disconnected. Her new address from the settlement, the apartment Kane's attorney arranged as part of the sealed terms, had been vacated." He looked at Crow directly. "I don't know where Maria Gutierrez and her daughter are." The lobby was very quiet. "You think Kane's people got to them again?" Patch said. His voice was not a question. "I think a woman who accepted a settlement under coercive terms had information Kane didn't want examined," Foss said. And I think the sealed settlement was not the end of her involvement with his organization. It was the beginning of a different kind of involvement. He let that land. Kane doesn't just remove tenants from buildings. He collects vulnerabilities. He finds people with limited resources and limited options, and he turns the settlement process into leverage. Crow looked at the folder, at the 43 red marks on the map. He thought about Sarah Cole upstairs, about the oxygen concentrator and the tapped-out savings and the legal aid attorney and the February court date, about a woman who'd been fighting alone for months and had just said yes to letting people in. He thought about what it meant that Kane had been watching this building, watching Sarah, specifically, long enough to mobilize a building super and call a lawyer and send a truck to sit in a diner parking lot, all before the Ravens had made a single visible move. He thought he was already planning the next step when we arrived. Does he know about Lena? Crow said. Foss went very still. The daughter, Crow said. Does Kane have documentation on the family? Does he know about the child specifically? Foss opened the folder again, turned to a different page. A property management intake form, Kane's company's letterhead, filled in with tenant information. Name, age, occupants. Sarah Cole, 38. One dependent minor, age 9. He had known about Lena since the day they signed the lease. Crow looked at that form for a long moment. He looked at the 9 in the dependent age field, and he felt something move through him that was very cold and very still and very clear. He turned to his brothers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Bear, he said, go upstairs. You stay with Sarah and Lena. You don't leave that apartment. You don't open the door for anyone who isn't me or Stitch. Bear was already moving. Jimmy, Crow said, call Reyes. Medical emergency priority. I don't care what you have to say to get the appointment. Say it. Today. Jimmy had his phone out before Crow finished the sentence. He turned to Foss. What does Kane know about the inquiry last night? He knows someone with resources started pulling his portfolio documentation. He knows it wasn't law enforcement. The inquiry pattern was too lateral, too fast, too personally targeted. Foss met his eyes. He knows it's connected to this building. He was here this morning. That truck you probably saw. I saw it. I wasn't just sending a message, Foss said. He was assessing. He's trying to determine whether what just arrived in his orbit is something he can manage the way he's managed everything else. A pause. Mr. Mercer, Kane has a city council contact in Reading. He has a relationship with the county assessor's office that goes beyond professional. He has a real estate attorney who has made 4 separate harassment complaints against tenants disappear in the last 18 months. Another pause, harder. And he has something I haven't been able to fully document yet, but that I believe is true. He has someone inside the Reading Police Department's Civil Complaints Division. The fluorescent light buzzed. Crow looked at the map with its 43 red marks, and the photograph of the dark F-250 in its nighttime parking lot, and the intake form with the number 9 in the dependent age field, and he understood, completely and without residual ambiguity, what they had walked into. This was not a bully with a property portfolio. This was a man who had been building infrastructure for years, legal, political, and otherwise, specifically designed to make him untouchable. Every tenant who fought and lost made the infrastructure stronger. Every sealed settlement added another layer of insulation. Every person who disappeared quietly into a relocated apartment took a piece of evidence with them. And now Victor Kane had seen 11 Iron Ravens ride into his territory. And he was already deciding what to do about it. Crow's phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from a number he didn't recognize. No name, no prefix, just a Reading area code. You should ask your lawyer friend in Sacramento what he told his golf buddy last Thursday. Then you should ask yourself if Ghost's family is worth what's coming. One chance to walk away clean. He read it twice. He looked at Wrench, handed him the phone. Wrench read it. His jaw set. Preston Vale, Wrench said. Quiet. The name of the lawyer Crow had called at 1:15 in the morning. Golf buddy, Crow said. He thought about that call. About trusting Vale because he'd trusted him before, because he'd been useful before. Because 12 years of doing this work meant you built relationships, and you used them when you needed them, and you had to trust something or you couldn't operate at all. He thought about Vale playing golf. He thought about who played golf in Sacramento real estate circles, and who those people knew, and how fast a phone call moved in a network built on mutual interest and mutual exposure. He thought, you walked Ghost's family straight into the crosshairs. He took the phone back from Wrench. He looked at the text one more time, one chance to walk away clean, and felt something in him go very quiet and very final, the way things went quiet when a decision had been made before the mind caught up to it. When the body already knew what it was going to, he deleted the text. Not because it scared him, because keeping it meant it existed in a form that could be used against people he was responsible for. And Crow had been doing this long enough to know that the first thing you did when someone handed you a weapon aimed at yourself was remove it from the equation. He looked at Foss. How fast can you publish? Foss blinked. It was the first time his composure had shifted. That's not... I need more documentation. I need sourced verification on at least 3 of the... How fast, Crow said. If I give you what you need, today, how fast? 24 hours to editorial review, maybe 48. Then we have 48 hours before Kane decides that walking away clean isn't on the table anymore. He looked at Wrench. Get the bikes fueled. We're moving Sarah and Lena in the next 2 hours. Moving them where? Stitch said. Mercer Road. The clubhouse. 40 miles east, up in the foothills, behind a gate, on private land that Kane's truck and Kane's lawyers and Kane's golf buddies had no jurisdiction over and no easy access to. Nobody argued. They moved fast after that. The particular efficient speed of men who'd learned to operate under time pressure without letting the pressure make them sloppy. Stitch went upstairs to help Sarah pack what mattered. Jimmy coordinated the medical appointment, talking fast into his phone, his voice doing the thing it did when he was running on adrenaline and conviction simultaneously. Hector pulled Foss into the corner of the lobby and began a rapid, controlled information transfer. Names, dates, property addresses, the specific sequence of Kane's escalation campaign against Sarah, all of it precise and documented because Hector had the mind of a man who never forgot anything that mattered and very little that didn't. Crow stepped outside. The cold hit him straight on. The sky had made its decision about more snow and was now delivering on it. Fine, hard flakes. Not the soft accumulating kind, but the driven kind, the kind that found your face and stung. He stood at the base of the stairwell and looked at the street and breathed. He thought about Preston Vale, about the golf buddy, about the specific betrayal of a network you'd built over 12 years proving to have a hole in it you hadn't known was there. He was going to have to deal with that. Not now, but it was going to require dealing with. His phone buzzed again. Different number this time. He looked at it. Hector's contact at the county assessor's office. A text with 3 words. Kane is moving. He called back immediately. The contact picked up on the second ring, voice low, clearly not at his desk. He filed an emergency injunction an hour ago, the man said, against Sarah Cole's lease. His attorney is claiming imminent property damage risk from the oxygen equipment, fire hazard classification. It's procedural garbage, but it gets him an emergency hearing. When? Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Crow looked at the street. Which judge? A pause. Harlan, District Court, Civil Division. He knew that name, not personally, but he knew what it meant that Kane had filed with Harlan specifically, had gotten an emergency hearing with Harlan in under 24 hours. Judges didn't grant emergency hearings on oxygen equipment fire hazards on normal timelines. They did it when someone had made a call. Thank you, Crow said. He hung up. Bear appeared in the building doorway behind him. Sarah's packing. He paused. She's not moving fast. What's she doing? Standing in the kitchen, looking at the refrigerator. Crow went up. He found Sarah exactly as Bear had described, standing at the kitchen's edge, looking at Lena's drawings on the refrigerator. Not frozen with fear. Something else. The specific stillness of a person taking a last look at a thing they'd built. The way you looked at something before you accepted you were leaving it behind. She had a canvas bag half packed at her feet. The oxygen concentrator was already disconnected. Stitch had moved her to the portable unit, a smaller canister she wore on a strap over her shoulder. She looked diminished by it, and also entirely herself, which was a thing Crow was learning about Sarah Cole. She had the quality of remaining entirely herself, regardless of what was happening around her. He told her about the injunction. He kept it short. He watched her face absorb it. Tomorrow morning, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. He's not going to stop, she said. Not a question, not despair, just the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who'd been watching this pattern for months and had just received confirmation of what she already understood about it. No, Crow said, he's not. So what are you going to do? She looked at him directly. I need to know, not the general plan, specifically. What are you going to do? We're going to give the journalist everything he needs to publish tomorrow morning, Crow said, before the hearing, and we're going to be at that hearing. That's not enough. No, he said, it's not, which is why we're also going to Kane's office this afternoon. Her eyes didn't waver. That worries me. It should worry him. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, on the refrigerator, Lena's drawings. The detailed faces, the accurate proportions, the evidence of a child who paid close attention to things. She reached up and unpinned them, folded them carefully, put them in the canvas bag. Okay, she said. They were on the road by noon. The convoy moved differently now. Tighter, faster, the playful ease of Thursday night replaced by something purposeful and close. Wrench's truck carried Sarah and Lena in the cab, the portable oxygen unit between them, Lena's hand in her mother's. The Ravens surrounded the truck on both sides and from behind, not theatrically, just present. The natural geometry of men who understood what they were protecting and had positioned themselves accordingly. Crow rode point. The snow was coming harder now, the highway dusted white at the edges, the sky the low iron gray of a day that wasn't going to improve. He rode with his hands steady on the bars and his eyes moving, mirrors, road ahead, the gaps between cars. And he let himself think about what the afternoon was going to require. He'd been in confrontations before, many of them. He wasn't proud of all of them, and he wasn't ashamed of any of them, which was a distinction he'd worked out over decades and held on to because it was one of the things that made him functional. But this was different from what he'd done before, and he knew it. And the difference was this. In every previous confrontation, the leverage had been physical, presence. The overwhelming fact of 11 men who were not afraid and not moving. That was usually sufficient. People who preyed on the vulnerable typically did so because the vulnerable couldn't push back. And when something could push back, the calculation changed. Kane was not a typical case. Kane had infrastructure. Kane had a judge. Kane had a contact inside Vale's network. Kane had a city council relationship and an assessor's office relationship and a sealed settlement history that represented a wall of legal insulation built over years. He was a man who had thought carefully about every angle of attack and prepared for each one. Except this one. Crow thought, he's never had 11 Ravens walk into his office before. They dropped Sarah and Lena at Mercer Road at 1:15. The clubhouse was a converted ranch property. A main building, 2 outbuildings, a garage that held 8 bikes and Wrench's tools, and the particular smell of grease and old wood that Crow associated with the word home more than any other smell on earth. Bear and Stitch stayed. The other 9 rode back down the hill toward Redding. Kane Capital Properties occupied a suite on the 4th floor of a glass and steel building on Cypress Avenue that was the kind of building that announced its own respectability. Clean lines, lobby security, a parking structure with electronic gates. The building said, "Legitimate enterprise, please see the lobby directory." The building said, "We are not the kind of people who have problems." 9 Harleys pulling into the parking structure said something else. The security guard at the lobby desk was 23 years old and was not paid enough for this. He saw them coming through the glass before they reached the door, and he picked up his phone and put it back down and picked it up again, which told Crow that he'd been briefed. That Kane had anticipated this, had told his lobby security to call if anyone matching a description arrived, which meant Kane was in the building, which meant Kane had decided to hold his ground rather than absent himself, which was either confidence or arrogance, and in Crow's experience, those were the same thing in different lighting. "We're here to see Victor Kane," Crow told the guard. His voice was level and completely ordinary, which was its own kind of pressure. "Suite 412. Tell him Maddox Mercer is here about the Sarah Cole property account." The guard made the call. His hand wasn't quite steady. He listened. He looked at Crow. "He says he doesn't have an appointment with you." "Tell him I know about Maria Gutierrez," Crow said. The guard relayed it. A longer pause this time. Then, "He'll see you, 4th floor." They rode the elevator in shifts, Crow, Patch, Wrench, and Jimmy in the first car, the others following. The elevator opened onto a carpeted hallway that smelled of recycled air and money, the kind of office floor where every surface was chosen to signal permanence and stability. Framed property photographs on the walls. Buildings before and after. The visual language of a man who remade things and considered this a virtue. Victor Kane's assistant was a woman in her 50s who had clearly also been briefed and was managing her expression with the rigid professionalism of someone determined to maintain the appearance of normalcy regardless of what walked through the door. She showed them to the conference room. She did not make eye contact with anyone except Crow. Kane was already there. He was 60, gray-haired, in a dark suit that fit the way expensive suits fit, as if it had been made for his specific body, which it probably had. He was not a large man, not physically imposing. He had the build of someone who had understood early that physical imposing wasn't necessary when you had other tools. He was sitting at the head of the conference table with his hands folded on its surface, and an expression of deliberate calm, the kind of calm that was a performance of calm, that was itself a form of aggression. Look how unafraid I am. Look how little you register as a threat. His attorney was beside him. 40-something, precise-looking, the legal pad in front of him already open and dated at the top. Kane looked at the 9 bikers filling his conference room doorway, and he said, "Gentlemen," in a tone that was meant to be dismissive and mostly was. Crow sat down across from him. The others arranged themselves around the room, not threateningly, not with any gesture that could be characterized as threatening, just present, filling the space, the overwhelming physical reality of 9 men who had decided to be somewhere. Patch stood near the window, Wrench near the door. Jimmy was the one who looked youngest and least dangerous, which is why Crow had brought him. Because Kane would look at Jimmy and see something manageable, and that misreading would cost him. "I know why you're here," Kane said. "You want me to back off the eviction. You've been asking questions about my portfolio. You brought your—" A pause, the pause of a man selecting a word. "Associates." He unfolded his hands. "Oh, let's talk." "Maria Gutierrez," Crow said. Something moved through Kane's expression, very fast, very controlled. "I don't discuss settled matters. She's missing," Crow said. "Her and her daughter, 9 years old. They relocated after your settlement, and now nobody can find them." "That's not my concern." "It will be," Crow said, "because Daniel Foss at the Sacramento Examiner has been working that story for 14 months, and tomorrow morning he publishes with or without your comment." He watched Kane's face. "Do you want to give a comment?" Kane looked at his attorney. The attorney's pen had gone still on the legal pad. "You have 43 properties," Crow said, 14 months of documented escalation campaigns, a pattern of sealed settlements obtained under coercive conditions. An emergency injunction filed this morning with Judge Harlan, who apparently grants you emergency hearings on timelines that would take most people 3 weeks. He paused. And a black F-250 that spent 4 minutes in a diner parking lot at 3:40 in the morning because you got a phone call from someone inside Preston Vale's network. The performance of calm on Kane's face was developing fractures. "What do you want?" Kane said. "Flat now. The social performance gone." "Drop the injunction," Crow said. "Cancel the eviction. Forgive every fee you've invented for Sarah Cole's account. And write a check to her medical fund for every dollar of rent she's paid you in the last 14 months. That's not—" "And find Maria Gutierrez," Crow said. "Because if she's missing because of you, that becomes a different conversation with different people than the ones in this room." Kane looked at him. Really looked at him. Past the performance, past the calculation, the look of a man trying to take the true measure of something. "You don't have evidence that connects me to—" "I don't need evidence," Crow said. "Foss has evidence. I just need you to understand what happens if you make this harder than it needs to be." He looked at Kane steadily. "Drop the injunction. Today. Before 5 o'clock. Or tomorrow morning, every tenant in 43 properties across 4 counties wakes up to a front-page story, and Judge Harlan gets a call from an attorney who isn't connected to your golf game." The conference room was very still. Kane's attorney leaned toward him and said something low. Kane didn't look at him. He was looking at Crow. "I need time to—" "You don't have time," Crow said. "You have until 5 o'clock. Patch, at the window, shifted his weight slightly. He wasn't doing anything. He was just shifting his weight, the natural movement of a large man who'd been standing still. But in the silence of the conference room, it had a weight of its own. Kane looked at Patch. He looked at the others around the room. He looked back at Crow. And in his expression, for the first time, something cracked through the engineered calm. Not fear, exactly, but the specific recognition of a man who had been very good at identifying the limits of other people's willingness to push, and who was now looking at something that didn't appear to have those limits. Men who'd been to war. Men who'd buried brothers. Men who were sitting in this conference room not because they needed to be here, but because someone they'd already decided to protect was in a collapsing apartment 3 miles away breathing through a tube. Kane opened his mouth. His phone buzzed on the table between his hands. He looked at it. Something changed in his face. Fast, visceral, a flash of something that was closer to alarm than anything Crow had seen from him yet. He looked up. "Excuse me," he said. He stood. His attorney grabbed his arm, a quick, urgent grip that Kane shook off, and he walked out of the conference room. Crow looked at the attorney. The attorney looked at his legal pad. Wrench caught Crow's eye from the doorway and gave him the very small nod that meant something just changed. 30 seconds. 40. The sound of Kane's voice from the hallway. Low, fast, urgent, the cadence of someone receiving information they hadn't anticipated. The attorney's pen moved once across the legal pad, and then stopped. He was listening. Kane came back in. He looked different, not just shaken, reconfigured, like a man who'd been operating according to one map and had just been handed a different one. He sat down. He looked at his attorney. The attorney nodded once. Kane looked at Crow. "Maria Gutierrez," he said. His voice had changed. Flatter. Emptier of the engineered control. "She's not missing because of me." Crow waited. "She was relocated through my settlement, yes," Kane said. "But she contacted me 4 months ago, voluntarily." He stopped. "She said someone had been following her, someone connected to... She said she'd talked to a journalist. She said after she talked to the journalist, things started happening." He pressed his mouth flat. "She was scared. She asked me to help her disappear." He looked at Crow. "I moved her. Not because I was protecting myself. Because she asked me to." The silence in the conference room had a different quality now. "Who was following her?" Crow said. "She didn't know a name," Kane said. "But she described..." He stopped. Looked at his attorney again. The attorney gave him a look that was professional advice wordlessly delivered. "Stop talking." Kane ignored it. "She described a man who'd been asking about the settlement, about the sealed terms, about what she'd agreed not to say." He looked at Crow directly. "Not Foss. Someone else. Someone who wanted to know what was in the sealed settlement badly enough to frighten a woman with a 9-year-old daughter into hiding." He paused. "Someone who apparently has now turned their attention to Sarah Cole." Crow felt the floor shift. Not Kane. Not Kane's network. Not Kane's golf buddy. Not Kane's judge. Not the sealed settlements or the 43 properties or the infrastructure of a predatory landlord. Something behind Kane. Something that had been watching the pattern of vulnerable tenants and sealed settlements and relocated families, not to exploit it the way Kane exploited it, but for a different reason. A reason that had made Maria Gutierrez frightened enough to ask her landlord, the man who'd put her in a collapsing apartment and manufactured her eviction, to hide her from it. Crow looked at Foss's folder in his hand, at the 14 months of documented investigation, at the photograph of the dark F-250 in the Stockton parking lot. He thought, Foss has been investigating Kane for 14 months. He thought, who else has been watching Kane's tenants for 14 months? He thought, what is in those sealed settlements that someone needs badly enough to follow a relocated woman and her 9-year-old daughter until she disappears? His phone buzzed. Bear. One word, come now. He was out of his chair before the phone was back in his pocket, moving through the conference room door, into the hallway, toward the elevator, Patch and Wrench right behind him, the others falling in, the attorney's voice saying something behind them that nobody. Bear's text had said, come now, and nothing else, which meant the situation at Mercer Road had changed in a way that couldn't be explained in a text message, which meant Crow was doing 90 on the highway with 8 bikes behind him and the snow coming sideways and his hands steady on the bars, the way they stayed steady when the steadiness was the only thing he could control. He didn't let himself think about what he was riding toward. I thought about the road. He thought about the distance. He thought about the specific geometry of a county highway in winter, the way ice formed first at the shoulder and worked inward, the way the center line disappeared under fresh snow, the way you read the texture of the white ahead of you and made constant small adjustments that kept 40 miles an hour from becoming a county road and a patch of black ice in a Tuesday afternoon in November. I thought about Ghost for exactly 3 seconds and then put it away. The gate at Mercer Road was open when they arrived. Bear had left it open, which meant he'd been watching for them, which meant he'd heard the bikes coming down the private road from far enough away to get to the gate. He was standing just inside it when Crow killed the engine and dismounted, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was containing something. The particular stillness of a large man who'd learned that his size meant his emotional reactions had physical weight, and that the people around him needed him to manage that. "She's inside," Bear said. "She's okay. Both of them are okay." Crow looked at him. "Tell me." "Man came to the gate," Bear said, "an hour ago. Said he was with Kane's attorney's office. Said he had papers to deliver." Bear's jaw worked once. "He wasn't. Stitch ran the plates on his car while I was talking to him through the intercom. Rental. Paid cash. Registered to a name that doesn't exist in any database Stitch could access in 3 minutes." "What did he want?" "He left an envelope in the gate mailbox and drove away." Bear reached into his vest pocket. The envelope was plain white, unsealed, a single folded page inside. He handed it to Crow. Crow unfolded it, typed. No letterhead, no signature. The sealed settlements contain documentation of building code violations that implicate 3 city officials and 1 county assessor. These individuals have been aware of Kane's practices and have received compensation for their silence. Maria Gutierrez witnessed a meeting between Kane and 2 of these officials. Her testimony would end careers and trigger criminal investigations. She came to us because she had nowhere else to go. She is safe. Her daughter is safe. We are not your enemy. But the people whose names are in those settlements will not stop. Not for you, not for Kane, not for anyone. Get the woman and the child out of California. Crow read it twice. He looked at Bear. "Who is we?" Bear said. Not a question. The same thing Crow was thinking, said aloud. He folded the letter. He put it in his inside pocket, beside Ghost's letter, the 2 pieces of paper pressing together through the leather like something with weight. He went inside. Sarah was in the main room of the clubhouse, sitting on the long couch with Lena beside her and the portable oxygen unit on the cushion to her right. She'd been given coffee. There was a mug in her hands, held with both palms the way Crow held his, for the warmth rather than the drinking. She looked at him when he came through the door. She read his face. "Tell me," she said. He sat down across from her. He told her. He kept it short and precise. The conference room, Kane's changed expression, the revelation about Maria Gutierrez, the phone call that had pulled Kane out of the room, and now the envelope at the gate and its unsigned message about city officials and county assessors and documentation that could end careers. He watched her face absorb it. She didn't break. She didn't go pale or start shaking or do any of the things that the weight of this information could reasonably produce. She sat with it the way she sat with difficult things, by going very still and very present, by letting the information find its proper shape before she responded to it. Lena was watching her mother, 9 years old, sitting straight, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. "Maria Gutierrez," Sarah said finally. "Yes." She was protecting her daughter from people who would hurt them to keep a secret. She looked at the coffee mug. "And now someone we don't know, has her somewhere safe. That's what the letter says. And they're telling us to leave California." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "What do you think?" He thought about 3 city officials and a county assessor. He thought about the kind of men who took money to look away while a predatory landlord ran vulnerable tenants out of their homes, who had presumably been doing it long enough and comfortably enough that the idea of documentation surfacing felt like an existential threat rather than a professional embarrassment. He thought about what men like that were capable of when they felt cornered. He thought about Lena's drawings on a refrigerator he'd never see again. "I think the letter is telling the truth," he said. "I think Kane is a piece of something larger than we understood walking in. And I think the people above him have more resources and less restraint than he does." "So we run," Sarah said. "I don't use that word." "What word do you use?" "Strategic relocation," Wrench said from the doorway. He said it with the particular dry flatness of a man who'd learned that the right amount of dark humor at the right moment kept rooms from collapsing under their own weight. Sarah looked at him. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the acknowledgement of the possibility of one. Then it went away and she looked back at Crow. "I've been in this apartment for 4 years, she said. "I have 2 boxes of Ethan's things in the closet, his tools in the storage unit. Lena's school is 6 blocks away." She paused. "Her teacher knows about her lung. Knows to let her sit near the window. Knows she draws when she's processing something difficult. Another pause, smaller. I can't just... Mom, Lena said. Sarah looked at her daughter. Dad wrote the letter, Lena said. The one in Crow's pocket. He said find them if you need help. He said trust them. She looked at her mother with those serious, too old eyes. He knew something. He knew we might need to run someday. That's why he kept updating the address. The room held that. Crow thought about Ghost maintaining a folder, updating it right up until 8 months before he died. Not because he planned to use it, but because he knew, in the specific way that people who've lived dangerous lives knew things, that the world had edges, and that edges could find you even when you'd walked away from them, and that when they did, you needed to have left a thread. Ghost had known something was wrong. Not specifically, not the officials and the assessor and the sealed settlements. But he'd felt the edges getting closer. And he'd updated the folder and he'd never called, and then there'd been a Tuesday afternoon in November. Crow pressed his hand flat against his chest, against the 2 letters there, and made himself breathe. We're not asking you to run forever, he said. We're asking you to go somewhere safe while we finish this. Finish it how? Sarah said. Foss publishes tomorrow morning, Crow said. What he has on Kane is enough to open a public investigation. Once it's public, once it's on record, the calculation for the people above Kane changes. They're not trying to keep a secret anymore. They're trying to manage a scandal. And managing a scandal is different from making a problem disappear. He looked at her steadily. It doesn't protect you perfectly, but it changes the math. The risk of making you disappear goes up sharply once your name is in print. And the city officials, Sarah said, the ones in the settlements. Hector has a contact at the state attorney general's office, Crow said. Not a favor. A legitimate contact, a prosecutor who's been building a municipal corruption case for 2 years and needs exactly the kind of evidence that's in those sealed settlements. He paused. We get him the settlements. We get him Kane's portfolio documentation. We get him what Foss has. And we give him Maria Gutierrez's name as a potential witness and let the people currently keeping her safe know that there's a prosecutor who can offer her actual protection rather than a letter in a mailbox. Sarah looked at him for a long time. You put this together in the last hour, she said. I put parts of it together in the last hour. The rest has been assembling since 3 in the morning when a 9-year-old girl told me my dead brother trusted me with his family. He met her eyes. I'm sorry it took me this long to understand what I was walking into. I'm not sorry we walked into it. She looked at the coffee mug. She looked at Lena. She looked at the room around her, the clubhouse's main room, which was large and warm and smelled of wood smoke and motor oil, and the decades of living that men who'd chosen this life had left in its walls. It was not a comfortable room in the conventional sense. The furniture was mismatched and heavy, the decorations were sparse and practical, but it was solid. The walls were thick. The gate at the bottom of the road was steel. Where would we go? She said, quietly. The question of someone who had made her decision and was now moving to logistics. I have a sister in Portland, Crow said. She's not in this life. She's got a house with a room, and she's the kind of person who doesn't ask questions and doesn't answer doors she's not expecting. He paused. It's temporary, weeks, not months, until the publication and the AG contact and the public record changed the situation. Sarah nodded. Once. The same small crossed-line nod as before. Not surrender, just the acknowledgement of what the moment required. Lena, she said, go get your bag. Lena got up without a word and went down the hall. Her footsteps were quiet on the hardwood. She'd been sitting here for over an hour in a biker clubhouse, and she had been entirely herself throughout, not performing bravery, not performing calm, just present and clear-eyed and waiting for the adults around her to sort out the world she was living in. Crow thought about Ghost, about the specific way Ghost had looked when he'd shown Crow that photograph of Sarah laughing, that private, lit-from-inside grin. He thought about what it cost to build something that good, and what it cost to lose it, and what it said about a man that the thing he'd built survived him. I went outside. The snow had stopped. The foothills around Mercer Road were white and still in the late afternoon light, the pines holding their snow in the particular patient way of trees that had been doing this a long time. The sky had cleared to a pale, thin blue at the western horizon, the kind of sky that came after a storm. Not peaceful exactly, but cleansed, stripped of the gray weight it had been carrying. The air smelled of pine and cold, and faintly the exhaust of 8 Harleys standing in the gravel yard. Crow looked at his brothers. They were arranged around the yard in the loose, familiar way. Some sitting on their bikes, some standing, Hector on his phone in the far corner, Jimmy leaning against the fence with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance. Patch was near the gate, watching the road the way Patch watched everything, fully, quietly, without performance. Wrench was checking something on his bike that probably didn't need checking but gave his hands something to do. Crow looked at them and thought about what it cost to have this. Not the club, not the brotherhood as an abstraction. This, specifically. These men, this yard, this cold afternoon. The specific price in years and choices and losses that had produced this arrangement of people who would ride through a blizzard on a Thursday night and spend the following 24 hours dismantling a predatory landlord's infrastructure because a 9-year-old girl had walked through a diner door with her father's eyes. He thought about what he owed them. He thought about what Ghost had owed them and hadn't been able to say, and had tried to maintain in a folder of updated addresses. He walked to the center of the yard. They gathered around him without being asked, the natural gathering of people who understood that when Crow stood in the center of something, there was something to be said. "Hector," he said. Hector came off his phone. "AG contact is in. He wants the documentation tonight if we can get it to him. He says if the settlements contain what we're describing, he can have a filing ready to accompany Foss's publication tomorrow." "Can we get the settlements?" "Foss has copies," Hector said. "He's been holding them because he couldn't verify the officials' identities from them alone. With what Kane told you in the conference room, combined with what Foss has, he said it's enough." "Call him," Crow said. "Tell him we need everything he has tonight, and tell him the AG's office is ready to receive it simultaneously with the publication." Hector was already dialing. Crow looked at Wrench. "Portland. I need the ride arranged for Sarah and Lena. Tonight. Not bikes. Wrench's truck. I want Stitch driving, Bear riding along. Somebody Sarah's already comfortable with." Wrench nodded. "The rest of us are going back to Kane's building," Crow said. "Not to his office. To the apartment building. 3rd floor east wing. The super shut down the boiler on Kane's instruction. I want that boiler running by tonight, and I want the super to understand that his employment arrangement with Kane is over, and I want documentation of that instruction. The one Kane gave him to shut the boiler down. Delivered to Foss and to the AG tonight alongside the settlement papers." He paused. "And I want every tenant on the 3rd floor east wing to have Hector's number. Not mine, Hector's. Because Hector is the one who will answer the phone at 2 in the morning when something goes wrong after we're gone." Hector looked at him. Something moved through his expression. The thing that moved through his expression sometimes. The deep old thing that had to do with his son, and the 8 years since, and the specific way that loss had redirected him toward the care of people he could still protect. He nodded. Crow looked at Jimmy last. Jimmy, who was 26 and had Ghost kind of recklessness. The kind that looked like courage because it came from the right place. Who had bought a jacket in the right size and hot chocolate nobody asked for, and driven 15 miles to a pharmacy at midnight because it was the obvious right thing to do, and he was young enough that obvious right things still felt urgent rather than complicated. "You're with me," Crow said. Jimmy straightened off the fence. "Yeah," he said. No question. No hesitation. They went back to Reading in the late afternoon. The apartment building on the east side looked different in the thin winter sunlight than it had in the morning's gray. Not better, exactly, but more visible. The details clearer. The leaning fence, the cracked parking lot, the windows with their curtain movement evidence of lives being lived carefully behind glass. The Ravens pulled in and the curtains moved again, the same first-floor resident assessment that had happened this morning, and then something different. A second-floor window with an elderly woman's face in it, watching. Not with alarm, with something that looked more like the watchfulness of a person who'd been waiting to see if anything was going to change. Crow went to the maintenance store. The building's super, a man named Terrence, 58, who had worked buildings his whole adult life and who had been afraid since this morning and was still afraid, but was also, underneath the fear, deeply and visibly tired of being afraid, opened the door before Crow knocked. He'd seen them pull in. "I know why you're here," Terrence said. "The boiler," Crow said. "I'll turn it on." "Right now." "Yes. And you're going to write down what Kane's office told you to do. The date, the time, who called, what they said. Exactly. And you're going to give that document to the man I'm going to introduce you to tonight." Terrence looked at him. He had the eyes of someone who'd been making small accommodations to people with power for so long that the accommodations had stopped feeling like choices and started feeling like weather. Just things that happened to you, just the way things were. He looked at Crow's face and at the ravens behind him and at something he apparently found there that the weather did not contain, and he said, "Okay, you're not going to lose your job," Crow said. "Kane's going to be occupied with other things by tomorrow morning." Terence looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back and went to the boiler room. The heat came on 40 minutes later. Crow was in the lobby when it happened. The particular sound of a building's heating system catching and running, the click and hiss of radiators waking up, and then the quality of the air in the lobby shifting, very gradually, from the cold that had been living in it for 3 days toward something warmer. The elderly woman came downstairs. She was 70-something, small, in a heavy cardigan, her hair white and carefully arranged. She came down the stairs and into the lobby and looked at Crow and his brothers, and then looked at the radiator in the lobby corner, which was beginning to tick with the sound of warming metal. She looked back at Crow. 3 days, she said. "I've been using my oven for heat for 3 days." "I know," Crow said. "My neighbor, Mr. Petrov, upstairs. He's 81. He's been sick." She looked at the radiator. "You fixed it." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment, at the raven tattoo on his forearm, at the vests, at the 11 large men standing in her building lobby in leather and road dust. She seemed to do some internal accounting, some private revision of the categories she'd been using to organize the world. "Are you coming back?" she said. "Hector," Crow said, and Hector came forward and gave her his number written on the back of a gas receipt because nobody carried business cards. And she took it and looked at it and folded it into her cardigan pocket. "Thank you," she said. She went back upstairs. The evening moved through its hours. Foss arrived at Mercer Road at 6:30 with 2 boxes of documentation, 14 months of work, organized with the meticulous care of a man who'd been carrying this story long enough that it had become personal without becoming sloppy. He and Hector spread it across the clubhouse's main table and worked through it systematically, pulling the specific pieces the AG needed, building the package that would go out simultaneously with the publication. The AG's office sent a secure email address. The files went at 9:15. At 10, Foss sat back from the table and looked at the assembled documentation with the expression of a man who'd been holding something heavy for 14 months and had just set it down on a surface strong enough to hold it. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 6 a.m. publication. Crow nodded. "What happens to Kane?" Foss said. "That's for the AG," Crow said. "And for the judge who isn't Harlan." Foss looked at him. "You know what I mean, not legally. What happens to the people who are paying him?" Crow thought about the unsigned letter, about the people above Kane who had more resources and less restraint, about 3 city officials and a county assessor whose names were in documents that were now in the hands of a state prosecutor. "They become somebody else's problem," Crow said. "Somebody with a badge and a filing deadline." He looked at Foss directly. "Maria Gutierrez. Her name goes in the article." "I know. Because whoever has her, whatever their reasons, she needs official protection. The AG needs her testimony, and she needs what only the AG can give her: actual immunity, actual relocation, actual legal cover. The letter in the mailbox isn't enough." "I know," Foss said again. He looked at his files. "I'll make sure she's findable." At 10:30, Stitch and Bear loaded Sarah and Lena into Wrench's truck. Sarah came out of the clubhouse with her canvas bag over one shoulder and the portable oxygen unit on the other, and Lena's hand in hers, and she stood in the gravel yard in the cold night air and looked at the ravens standing there, all of them, because none of them had gone home. None of them had decided that their part in this was done, and she seemed to need a moment to absorb the fact of them. Crow walked to her. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry but not empty. Full, actually, full of things she wasn't going to say with 11 people watching and a long drive ahead and a 9-year-old daughter holding her hand. Ethan would have... She stopped. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "Don't make it about what he would have said. This is about what you need right now." She looked at him. "My sister's name is Carol," he said. "She's going to feed you and ask you nothing and let Lena have the room with the purple walls. She painted them herself when she was about Lena's age, and she never repainted them, and she's always waiting for the right kid to appreciate them." Sarah's expression did the thing it had been doing since that morning in the apartment, the thing where the fortress walls came down just enough to show the work they'd been doing, just enough to show what was behind them. She pressed her lips together and looked away for a second, at the pine trees and the cold stars. Then she looked back. "Thank you," she said. "I know that's not enough." "It's everything," he said. She nodded. She turned to the truck. Lena stopped. She let go of her mother's hand and turned back to Crow. And she looked up at him the way she'd been looking at him since the diner. That direct, complete attention, Ghost's eyes, Ghost's refusal to look away from things that needed looking at. "Are you going to be okay?" she said. Something in his chest moved. "Yeah," he said. "Promise?" He looked at this 9-year-old who had walked 3 miles through a blizzard and sat down across from the most dangerous man in a diner full of dangerous men and asked him to help her family, and he thought about what it cost to make a promise to someone who already understood what it meant when promises didn't get kept. "Promise," he said. She looked at him for a long 3 count. Then she nodded once, the same nod her mother used, the same crossed-line acknowledgement, the family gesture passing down through 2 generations of stubborn women, and she got in the truck. Crow stood in the gravel yard and watched the truck's taillights go down the private road and through the gate and disappear around the tree line, and the cold night air pressed against the back of his neck, and the pines stood dark against the stars. And somewhere behind him, one of his brothers lit a cigarette. He didn't move for a while. Nobody asked him to. The night passed the way long nights passed, in the specific rhythm of waiting and working and the occasional necessary silence. He and Patch and Jimmy drove back to Reading at 11 and made 2 stops, one to the apartment building to check that the heat was holding and leave Hector's number under the doors of every unit on the 3rd floor east wing, and one to a 24-hour copy shop where they made physical copies of everything Foss had sent digitally, because Crow was old enough that he did not entirely trust the permanence of the digital, and he wanted paper somewhere that wasn't a hard drive. They drove back to Mercer Road at 2 in the morning. Wrench had made coffee, the real kind, not the terrible diner kind, which was a mercy. The surviving members of the evening sat around the clubhouse's main table with their mugs and the particular bone-level tiredness of a long day that had asked a lot of them, and the conversation was slow and occasional and comfortable, the conversation of men who didn't need to fill silence to justify the company. Hector talked about his son for a while, not the loss. He never talked about the loss. He talked about who his son had been, the way he'd laughed, the specific jokes he'd made. The afternoon he'd decided he was going to learn to ride, and had spent 3 hours in the parking lot of an empty shopping mall going slowly in circles. He was terrible at it, Hector said. Absolutely terrible. He didn't care. He kept going in circles and grinning. He was looking at the table when he said it, turning his mug in his hands. He had that kind of stubbornness, the kind that felt like joy. Nobody said anything. They didn't need to. Crow thought about Ghost, about the postcards, about the photograph on Sarah's refrigerator of a man laughing at something off camera, the particular aliveness in his expression. He thought about the folder that Ghost had maintained for 6 years, the specific act of love embedded in updating a list of addresses, of keeping a thread intact for people who might need it, of trusting that the thread would hold. He pulled out Ghost's letter. He read it one more time in the clubhouse's warm light. Tell him I never stopped counting them. Tell him I'm sorry I didn't call. And tell him I trust him with the only thing I ever loved more than the road. He folded it. He put it back in his pocket. He was going to keep it there for a while. Foss's article published at 6:07 in the morning. Crow was awake for it, had been awake since 4, sitting in the clubhouse with his second mug of Wrench's coffee and the early morning silence of a building that had held a lot of noise the previous day and was now catching its breath. He read the article on his phone, sitting by the window where the first thin gray light of a California winter morning was beginning to separate the dark from the dark. Foss had written it well. Precisely. The kind of precision that came from 14 months of careful work and the very specific skill of knowing which details to use and which to leave out, so the story could hold its own weight without collapsing under it. Kane's name, the 43 properties, the pattern across 4 counties, the sealed settlements and the coercive terms, the names of 3 city officials and 1 county assessor, named explicitly and sourced through the documentation the AG's office had confirmed they were acting on. The building on the east side of Reading with the boiler that had been off for 3 days. And at the bottom, 2 paragraphs about Maria Gutierrez. Her name, her case, the note that her current whereabouts were unknown, but that she had been identified as a key witness in a state prosecution, and that anyone with information about her location was urged to contact the AG's office directly. The light outside was turning from gray toward the pale, specific blue of early morning. Crow's phone began going off at 6:15. The first call was from Hector's AG contact. Brief, professional, confirming that the filings were proceeding and that search warrants for Kane's records had been signed by a judge who was not Harlan. The second call was from a number he didn't recognize, which he answered and which turned out to be a tenant from the third-floor East Wing, an elderly man, the one named Mr. Petrov, that the woman in the cardigan had mentioned, 81 years old, calling the number that had been slipped under his door in the night, his voice careful and slightly formal, to say thank you for the heat and to ask if the number would continue to work. "Yes," Crow said, "it'll continue to work." "Good," the old man said. "Good," and hung up. The third call was from Carol in Portland. "They got here at 6 this morning," his sister said. She had the voice of a woman who'd grown up watching her older brother carry things and had learned to not comment on it and to simply report the relevant information. The little one slept the whole drive. She woke up, saw the purple room, and asked if she could draw on the wall. "What did you say?" "I said yes." A pause. "She's drawing a raven." Something happened in Crow's chest that he wasn't going to analyze right now because it was early in the morning and he hadn't slept in 30 hours. And the day was still ahead of him, and some things were better received in motion than in stillness. "How's Sarah?" he said. "Asleep, finally." Carol paused. "Crow." "Yeah." "She told me about Ethan." He looked at the window, at the blue light getting stronger, at the pine trees on the hill above Mercer Road, their snow-held branches beginning to shed in the warming air, small avalanches of white dropping silently to the ground. "I know," he said. "You should have called him," Carol said, without accusation, just the honest observation of a woman who said true things. "I know," he said again. "You're not going to stop thinking about it." "No." "Good." Another pause. "That means you're paying attention." He was quiet for a moment. "Take care of them, Carol." "Obviously," she said, and hung up. He set the phone down on the windowsill. He sat with the morning for a while, the specific quality of it, the winter light on the snow outside, the sound of the buildings settling around him, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the decades embedded in the walls. He thought about everything that the last 30 hours had asked of him, and what they'd taken and what they'd returned. He thought about a 9-year-old girl drawing a raven on a purple wall in Portland. He thought about Ghost. He thought, "I hear you, brother. I finally hear you." The Ravens were back at the Crow's Nest Diner 3 weeks later. It was a Thursday, because it was always a Thursday. That had not changed and was not going to change, because some things were worth maintaining specifically because they were ordinary, because the ordinary was what you were protecting when you protected anything. The same 4 tables in the back, the same duct-taped vinyl, the same Darlene with the same terrible coffee, which she set down without comment, and which each of them held in both hands for the warmth. The week since Foss's publication had been complicated in the specific way that complicated things were complicated. Not clean, not resolved in every direction simultaneously, but moving. Kane had retained criminal defense counsel. 2 of the 3 named city officials had resigned before noon on the day of publication. The county assessor had hired a lawyer and was cooperating with the AG's investigation in the particular way that people cooperated when the alternative was worse. Preston Vale had made a call to Crow that Crow had let go to voicemail and had not yet decided whether to return. Maria Gutierrez had been found, not by the AG's office, but by the people who had been keeping her safe, who had apparently read the article and made a decision. She and her daughter were now in protective witness status, working with the state prosecutor, building the case that would take considerably more months to resolve and would cost more than anyone currently understood. But it was building, it was real. The unsigned letter's authors remained unknown. Crow had theories, none of which he'd shared with anyone except Patch, who had theories of his own that overlapped with Crow's in ways that were interesting and not yet actionable. He'd decided to let that particular thread alone for now. Sarah had seen Dr. Reyes, not the Reading one, the UC Davis pulmonologist that Stitch's contact had arranged. And the news had been neither catastrophic nor simple, which was the honest range of news that serious illness produced. The taper schedule needed adjustment. There were options that hadn't been fully explored. The care plan was going to require time and consistency and the specific kind of stability that came from not being evicted and not running out of medication money and not lying awake at night calculating whether the heat was going to stay on. She was in Portland. She had a purple-walled room next door and a sister-in-law who cooked and asked nothing, and an oxygen concentrator that ran without a secondary space heater, and a medical fund that had received, on an anonymous basis, a bank transfer from 11 separate accounts that together covered the next 6 months. Lena had enrolled in a school 2 blocks from Carol's house. She'd sent Crow a drawing in the mail, an envelope addressed in careful block letters, Maddox Mercer, Mercer Road, with a hand-drawn compass rose in the corner of the envelope for navigation. Inside, a single sheet of paper, a detailed pencil drawing of the Crow's Nest Diner, the sign with its missing apostrophe, the fogged windows, the snow-drifted parking lot, the 10 bikes lined up in a row. And through the diner window, barely visible, 10 figures around 4 tables, and in the foreground, small but precise, a girl with a ponytail walking through the door. On the back, in the same careful block letters, "Thank you for keeping your promise." Crow had it in his inside pocket now, folded with ghost letter, the 2 pieces of paper together. He planned to keep them there for a while. He sat at the head booth with his back to the wall and his hands around his coffee mug and his brother's voices behind him and the sound of the winter outside, quieter tonight, just cold, no storm. And he thought about the specific weight of what the last 3 weeks had deposited in him. Not lighter, exactly, but differently distributed. The grief for Ghost was still there and was going to stay there and was not a wound he expected to close cleanly, but it had changed shape, had become something he could carry alongside the living instead of it. Jimmy slid into the booth across from him with his own coffee. He was 26 years old and had Ghost's kind of recklessness, and a face that still showed what he was feeling, and what he was feeling right now was the particular combination of tired and still moved that the last 3 weeks had deposited in all of them. "You think she'll come back?" he said. "Eventually, when it's safe." Crow looked at him. "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because she's got her dad's stubbornness," Crow said. "And her dad always came back." Jimmy turned his mug in his hands. He thought about that. Outside, the cold pressed against the diner's glass, and the neon sign threw its red light across the parking lot, and the pine forest stood dark and patient beyond the road. "You should have called him," Jimmy said. It came out careful. Not accusatory, just honest. The honesty of a young man who decided that Crow would rather hear the true thing than the comfortable thing. "Yeah," Crow said. "I should have." "Are you going to call people more?" Crow looked at him for a moment, at the young face, the open expression, the genuine question underneath the careful phrasing. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Jimmy nodded. He seemed satisfied with that. He settled back into the booth and looked around the diner, at Bear and Patch at the next table, at Wrench explaining something to Hector with his hands, at Stitch reading something on his phone, at Lobo and Cal and Dooley arguing about something that sounded like it was about a football game but probably wasn't, and his expression was the expression of someone taking inventory of something valuable. "Good," he said. Crow looked at Ghost's daughter's drawing in his pocket, the shape of it through the leather, the slight stiffness of the paper. He thought about a compass rose drawn in the corner of an envelope for navigation. He thought about a girl with 2 old eyes who'd understood, at 9 years old, that the worst thing wasn't walking into a room full of strangers. The worst thing was not walking in. He picked up his coffee. Outside, the Harleys stood in the cold parking lot in a row, their chrome catching the diner's neon light. 10 machines built for roads that went on past the edge of what you could see, built for the specific kind of motion that was not running from something but moving toward it. The motion of people who decided that the road ahead mattered more than the comfort of staying still. The coffee was terrible. It was, as always, exactly right. Crow drank it. And in the corner of his inside pocket, 2 folded pieces of paper pressed together, a father's last instruction and a daughter's first drawing. And the weight of them was not the weight of grief anymore. It was the weight of a promise kept. And that was a weight he could carry for the rest of his life.